Bioshock is a fantastic series, and it's due to how much these games affected me that I wanted to talk about them all with you. This video is actually 3 separate parts turned into a much larger project, with each video being made with the sole intention of not only retelling the story of these games, but to also allow me to give my thoughts on their stories along the way. If you're new here, then this is the perfect place to watch all 3 videos, but even if you've seen them already, there is an added section at the end where we discuss the 2 novels released during the game's lifecycle. With all of that out of the way though, welcome to the Bioshock Series Story Retrospective. Let's get started. Bioshock 1 has one of the most genius stories I have ever seen. Its central plot is brilliant, and the attention to detail when it came to its setting and world building is arguably a masterpiece just on its own. Today I want to look back on Bioshock's story and uncover what really made this one of the best games of all time despite it being 14 years old. As always, spoiler warning ahead for the whole story of Bioshock, and with that, let's get started. As always, we need to start at the prologue, but for Bioshock we need to go back even further. That title, Bioshock. It's such a bizarre word when you think about it. Many games have a very distinct title with weird meanings, but at least I could tell you what the words mean. Cyberpunk 2077 is a game with a cyberpunk art style that's set in the year 2077. A game like Dragon Age is a bit tricky as I've never played Dragon Age before, so while its title as a whole makes no sense to me, I can at least understand what the individual words mean, dragon, age, and origins, and maybe draw some conclusions about the game. But what is a Bioshock? I, like many, might think it's a homage to System Shock 2, which was Irrational Games' first project, but furthermore, it could also be a shortened version of Biological Shock, which in the context of the game makes sense given how Adam ruined this society and how our protagonist acts throughout the game, but we haven't gotten there yet, so I'll return to this in a moment. As we start the game, the player needs certain questions answered in order to feel invested in the story. Who are we? How did we get here? And does the story make sense? Bioshock creates a sort of meta-narrative based around these answers, but once again, more on that at the end of the video. Our first interaction with the game is a cutscene, and Bioshock wastes no time getting right into the action as the plane we're traveling on crashes in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. We awake amongst the wreckage and need to find land. The only place within eyesight is a giant lighthouse next to us. I've always seen this lighthouse as a beacon of light in a dark time, although it's a bit more literal in this case, as the only light we can see is the moon, the burning plane, and this lighthouse. As we enter, the door shuts behind us and we see a giant statue of a man with the phrase "No gods or kings, only man" written on a banner. While it's confusing as is, this confusion should actually start earlier. Why is there a lighthouse in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Even if we were to ignore that, why isn't there people in the lighthouse? There's so much wrong with all of this, and while that does sound like a criticism, I actually find it to be a wonderful decision, as it's making the player question everything they see. It's also the start of many mysteries this game will tease to the player, which causes them to become more invested in the world around them in an attempt to find out more. As we head down the stairs, we see 3 plaques with the words Art, Industry, and Science written on them, while a violin cover of Bobby Darin's Beyond the Sea accompanies us in the bathysphere. What's important to remember is why we're going in this submarine. We're in the middle of the ocean and it's the 60s. Even if others had survived that plane crash, who are we going to call for help? Our only option is this bathysphere, as it's either this or swimming at night in the Atlantic Ocean, and I'll take my chances. We presumably descend deeper into the lighthouse while a message plays from Andrew Ryan, someone who looks oddly similar to the statue upstairs. Bioshock has many memorable moments, and this will be one of 3 key moments throughout the entire game.
I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture.
Rapture might be my favorite setting in any video game ever made. Not just the idea, but the reasoning behind it is brilliant. The fact that a city not only exists at the bottom of the sea, but also functions at the bottom of the sea is something that has never been done before. Andrew Ryan also says that Rapture was made for those who do not fear censors or morality. It's a judgment-free place, but not in the sense of people getting along and being happy together, but a place that allowed those who wanted more to get more. Andrew Ryan says that the surface was constrained by laws and ethics, but Rapture was no such place. And it's because of this ideology that allowed Rapture to blossom into what we see now, a bustling city under the sea, completely shut away from society. At least that's what it seems like, until we actually enter Rapture. Our first encounter with the city is a very grim one, as we're going to be introduced to a man named Johnny until we get to see him sliced open right in front of us. We then meet with Johnny's killer, who screams at us before attempting to open the bathysphere. It's possible that her anger is the same as the people who used to be here, as there are signs everywhere saying things like "Ryan doesn't own us, let us leave and Rapture is dead. Earlier I talked about a light that shines in the darkness when I brought up the lighthouse. Atlas is like the lighthouse, but in a more metaphorical sense, as Atlas saves us from this person who is trying to kill us. His charming demeanor and attitude makes him instantly likable, and that is further reinforced by his own actions as, once again, he's trying to save us. We push further and are able to arm ourselves with a wrench. We can take a couple practice swings to test out our new weapon, but we can also get a look at these splicers Atlas was talking about, as they aren't alien creatures, but they don't look human anymore. Everything seems to be going smoothly so far given the circumstances until we see the Gatherer's Garden vending machine.
Steady now. Your genetic code is being rewritten. Just hold on and everything will be fine.
Look, Mr. Bubbles, it's an angel. I can see light coming from his belly. Wait a minute, he's still breathing. It's all right. I know he'll be an angel soon.
I can't explain to you how genuinely terrifying this was when I first played the game. Currently, we don't understand what a big daddy or little sister is just yet, so seeing a tiny child with a syringe as big as she is walking with a moving scuba suit is probably the most terrifying thing you'll ever see. We also discover that we can now cast electricity through our hands, which is just another bizarre and crazy thing that Rapture has. We also get a look at a concept that is shown throughout Rapture, and it's how the world continues to reinforce that you're underwater. It's not enough just to have a few windows that show the sea, but the effects that the outside environment can have on Rapture, such as the plane wing crashing into the tunnel causing all the water to flood inside. There are even smaller instances of this, such as the water falling from the ceiling or just puddles of water in places where it shouldn't be. Bioshock also shows other problems that Rapture can have, like a lack of electricity or when this elevator falls, and instead of just being a cool scene to ramp up the destruction, we can actually see someone walk out of it while on fire. It makes Rapture seem real, as it showcases how a place like this can have problems, but also what problems a place like this may face, like water damage and poor infrastructure. If you want to go even further than this is also the first showcase of how the splicers interact inside the game, as this female splicer is trying to sing a lullaby to her baby despite it being quite the frightening tale. She's talking about how her baby's going to be sold by the pound once her dad is gone and how she'll be alone when her parents are both dead, except it seems like she's losing her mind as she's struggling to figure out why her baby doesn't feel the same anymore, until we realize her baby's actually a pistol. Atlas was also listening in on this lullaby as he says that it was the plasmids that caused all the chaos. There's even an audio log not even a couple minutes later that captures one of the moments of Rapture's downfall.
Here's a toast to Diane McClintock, silliest girl in Rapture. Silly enough to fall in love with Andrew Ryan. Silly enough. What happened? I'm bleeding. Oh God. What's happening?
It seems that an explosion went off during the New Year's Eve party, presumably right where we're standing, which killed numerous people. We don't know why, but if we're to believe Atlas, plasmids caused it in some way. Later we get to see the little sister and Big Daddy again and are able to observe them without the fear of being stabbed, and it's quite the brutal scene. It shows the dynamic relationship between the two and also the importance of the little sister and the strength of the Big Daddies. We learn that the little sisters gather Adam while the Big Daddies protect them from people who want to harm them. It's also assumed that people might want to harm the little sister because of the Adam that she carries. After some fighting, we make it to the end of the intro where Andrew Ryan appears and notices that we've invaded his city. He asks if we're a part of the CIA or KGB, as he probably assumes that the only people capable of finding and infiltrating his great city would be the government, and he also thinks that the government either wants to put an end to his city or nationalize it, two things he'll never let happen. Despite being just a voice for a majority of the game, it's his personality and the power in his voice that makes him feel like a threat, and I've always liked how impressive the voice acting was for him. Of course, we have to escape his ambush and arrive at the medical pavilion, ending the tutorial. Bioshock's intro is pretty much perfect. We get a cohesive set of circumstances that show how our character made it to Rapture, and then get introduced to what Rapture looks like, how its inhabitants interact with the city, and a few pieces of information for the player to think about, like plasmids, Adam, Big Daddies, Little Sisters, and the downfall of Rapture. There is even a ton of things we still don't know yet, like who we are, who Atlas is, and how the plane crashed. And while I do wish more backstory was given on this, once you beat the game you realize it's impossible to talk about right now. There is so much mystery with Bioshock, from its setting to its characters to even the actual plot, that it makes you want to learn more. And while this information and mystery can be considered overwhelming when shown all at once, these mechanics, characters, and locations are everywhere, so it's hard not to remember them, and it also gives the player something to go off of instead of being left in the dark all game. It's also been like 15 minutes since we started the game, so it's not like it's been 4 hours of game time without any answers. We're just getting started, so having a bit of mystery is perfectly fine this early in the game, and the way this is pulled off in Bioshock is expertly done. From here, things start to become harder to talk about, as Bioshock's main world-building device is the audio logs we find scattered around the map. There is a common critique amongst gamers that it's unimmersive when there are audio logs or recordings scattered throughout the world, as it makes no sense that this many people would be using them when talking about the most mundane of topics. And while I definitely agree with this sentiment, I've always just chalked it up to a limitation of game design, especially in the case of Bioshock, where there are no NPCs the player can talk to learn about Rapture, so all their information has to be from the audio logs. Thankfully, there is a ton of them in this game and are extremely easy to find, as they glow and are more often than not found in areas you'll be traveling through anyway. These provide lots of context to Rapture's downfall and explain a lot of what's going on around the city, except they are everywhere throughout the game and not placed in the most linear fashion. For example, we see these ghostly apparitions throughout the game, but it isn't until we get to Arcadia, roughly 3 or so hours into the game, where we finally learn why we can see ghosts. I have no problem with the way these audio logs are structured, it just becomes a little harder to explain when making a video about it. So for now, we'll just be going in the order the game intended and occasionally go off the beaten path to discuss some other aspects of the game, like right now, as it's a perfect time to talk about Rapture itself. As I said before, it wasn't just the scenery of the city that made me love Rapture, but it's what it represents that intrigued me. Just like the title of the game, we need to address the main name of the city. Rapture, by definition, is a feeling of intense pleasure or joy, but it's also a theological belief within Christianity. Assuming my research is correct, it's an event that would be the end of times, where those who are faithful Christians, whether alive or dead, will be taken above the clouds to meet the Lord, while those who are not faithful will not be taken up, thus are condemned to whatever destruction the Rapture brings. Rapture the city relates to this, as you could infer that this place above the clouds would be considered a paradise for all Christians, so Rapture is a place for those who want to experience a paradise away from the mainland. As Ryan said, it's for the artist who doesn't fear censorship or the scientist who isn't bound by a petty morality. Rapture allows the creativity of the mind to be the only limit within its walls, and this is why the city of Rapture had so many scientific breakthroughs. The residents of Rapture never needed to worry about whether or not what they were doing was unethical, dangerous, or controversial, as they were given complete freedom. Rapture essentially went through a never-ending golden age of technological advancement. People were able to conjure elements through their hands and were able to have not just their facial features reconstructed, but their entire gender and even their race changed as well. Even though it all went to shit eventually, just the concept of Rapture is genius. It's incredibly thorough and really highlights the stellar writing of this game, as the biggest question that comes to mind is why build a city in the ocean? And yet the devs managed to not only give an answer to this question, but actually make it quite believable. Continuing where we left off, we had just escaped Andrew Ryan's ambush and have made it to the medical pavilion. According to Atlas, this is the direction we have to head in if we're to save his family. I said earlier how Bioshock's intro showcases how some of the splicers interact with the city, and while in that case it was just a small example, this concept gets brought up again but with more depth added to it. From the moment we enter the pavilion, we see signs and posters of a Dr. Steinman. He's the overseer of the medical pavilion and is also a very accomplished surgeon. One thing you'll notice about Bioshock is how all the named characters have a story about them. Each character has a backstory and a reason for coming to Rapture, and all their stories tie into the overarching story of Rapture. Each area also has a distinct look to them and a reason for being in the city, and both the levels and characters within them all tie into Rapture in some way, which we uncover from the audio logs. Dr. Steinman performed cosmetic surgery on the people of Rapture, but due to the circumstances of the city, he too became corrupt. Due to Rapture being a place where people can show their truest forms and are able to push the boundaries of their studies, Dr. Steinman would use this time to perfect his craft. Everything was going well until the discovery of Adam, as this sparked an idea in Steinman's head, as he thought this was a perfect opportunity to revolutionize the industry, hoping that with this new technology, surgeons could sculpt any kind of flesh with ease, but this of course led him down a darker path. See, Steinman was a perfectionist, and of course when you're a perfectionist, your standards are incredibly high, but Adam managed to push these even further.
Adam presents new problems for the professional. As your tools improve, so do your standards. There was a time I was happy enough to take off a wart or two, or turn a real circus freak into something you can show in the daylight, but that was then, when we took what we got. But with Adam, the flesh becomes clay. What excuse do we have not to sculpt and sculpt and sculpt until the job is done?
Dr. Steinman didn't go crazy just because of Adam. It was a combination of Adam, Rapture, and his inability to let the smallest problem go. He would change things that patients didn't want, and given that he's a professional in his line of work, he used this to reinforce his actions. Why argue with a professional after all? They know all there is to know. Steinman lost control and began working on anyone he wanted, even if they weren't a patient of his. His final decline is how we see him in-game. He moved away from the faces of his patients to their whole physique, claiming that this one was too fat, or this one's too tall, or that this one is too symmetrical. He ended up losing his mind when he was introduced to Adam. He wasn't an addict to the drug, but an addict to his work. He saw the potential of Adam, and his first thought was how far can he go without thinking how far should he go. This shows that Adam and even the policies of Rapture affected so many of its city's residents, and due to their different fields of study and different levels of wealth and social status, we're able to see how it affects everyone differently. This style of storytelling is flat out genius. It makes you want to go to the next area and uncover what the level is about, what it provides the city of Rapture, and how its unique setting caused its unique downfall. No game has ever gotten me to care this much about one small level, and I find that in itself very impressive. After we have dealt with Dr. Steinman, we enter the second key moment of Bioshock. As we approach this hallway, we see a Big Daddy get thrown through the wall. This is the first time we have not only seen a Big Daddy up close, besides the cutscene from earlier, but we actually see one defeated, so it must be a really tough opponent who brought him down, except it's just another splicer. Even though I've always found this almost impossible to happen, that's not the point of this scene, as now that the Big Daddy is dead, the little sister is alone. The splicer takes this opportunity to grab the little sister so he can take her at him, but a mysterious woman shoots him before he can do that. I'll bring her up in a moment, but right now she and Atlas give us a choice. These little sisters contain Adam, the core foundation of Rapture, and if we can get more, we can buy more plasmids and tonics to get stronger, but we're also doing so at the cost of potentially killing her. Rescuing a little sister will net us 80 Adam, but she lives. Harvesting her will give us 160, but she dies. It's a case of morality. Are you willing to sacrifice the life of a little girl for the benefit of your own? Especially when you uncover their origins, it makes the choice even more important. The little sisters were a creation of Tenenbaum, the woman from earlier, after discovering a sea slug that was able to cure the wounds of a smuggler when it bit him. After some research on the slug, she discovered what caused this anomaly and dubbed the substance Adam. She also discovered that it had the ability to splice people's DNA, giving them the opportunity to essentially have superpowers, leading to the creation of plasmids. The problem with Adam is that on its own, there wasn't enough to change anything, but Tenenbaum found a way to create Adam inside people's bodies, but once again this also failed as it wasn't enough. The only test that worked was with young girls, which was the start of the Little Sisters. Another problem arose as there wasn't enough girls to go around as who would willingly subject their daughters to this experiment. So Fontaine conspired with Tenenbaum to create an orphanage that would be used as a front to exploit the children and specifically take the girls to use them as hosts for Adam. Despite how creepy they may look, when you rescue them, you discover that they are just in fact little girls, not some mutant creature, but a living, breathing human. She, with the assistance of a Dr. Shu Chong, who we'll get to in a moment, subjected the little girls to mental conditioning so they can become valuable hosts. So she cares enough about the little sisters that when someone else hurts them, she'll defend them, but when she hurts them, it's okay. Her logic is clearly flawed, and there is a reason for that, as she feels awful about what she did, but the majority of the audio logs we find say the opposite. This makes Tenenbaum a hard person to trust, which not only reinforces the game's concept of morality when it comes to the little sisters, but also strengthens the relationship between you and Atlas. It's a great idea on paper, but horribly executed in game, sadly. According to Tenenbaum, if we save enough of her little ones, she'll give us a reward. This is in the form of a present near the plasmid vending machines that has Adam, a plasmid, and some other items like ammo and Eve. The number of Adam is consistent every time, so if we're to compare the two, we find out that every 3 little sisters rescued gives us 440 Adam, assuming you collect the present, and 480 if we harvest all of them. If the player were to rescue/harvest all 21 little sisters, they will get either 3,080 Adam or 3,360 Adam respectively. This is already a problem on its own, but they continue to add more items for the player, easily making rescuing the best option without even thinking about the morality of the situation. A 280 Adam difference in the grand scheme of things is really not that big of a deal, especially when you get to the end of the game when you can upgrade your plasmids that run as high as 180 Adam. Now maybe I play the game differently than others, but I never needed many plasmids during my playthrough. I wasn't constantly starved of Adam, I just needed a few important tonics and some go-to plasmids plasmids, and that was it. You really don't need an entire arsenal of tonics and plasmids to complete this game unless you're doing a sort of challenge run or something. What they should have done was kept the rewards from the present but cut the atom we get from the gifts and rescuing in half, going from a total of 3,360 atom if you harvest them to 1,680 if you choose to rescue all of them. This also cuts your survivability in half. All health and Eve upgrades are 80 atom each. Buying all of them throughout the game will set you back 1,280 atom, leaving you only 400 to use on upgrades and plasmids. So it creates the situation about whether or not you should dabble in more health or Eve or use the atom to upgrade your plasmids. This would make saving the little sisters a lot harder to do and force the player to actually choose between rescuing or harvesting them. Are you still willing to stick to your morals and never harvest one no matter how hard it gets, or are you going to cave in? Furthermore, are you going to justify your actions or live with the fact that what you did is wrong? If you plan on justifying it, aren't you no better than the people who live here? Like Steinman, who used his work as justification for his ruthless actions, or the loads of other people we'll meet soon who also did evil things because they were furthering their field of study. I'm also not the only one that thinks these rewards should have been handled better, as the creative director for the game even agrees.
Yeah, we went back and forth a lot about what the rewards for harvesting versus saving would be, and actually I think we should have really pushed further that the rewards for saving were should have been much more meager than the rewards for harvesting.
You probably have noticed by now that we've spent a lot of time talking about Dr. Steinman and the Little Sisters, but not about the actual medical pavilion itself, and this is where Bioshock tends to suffer a bit. The medical pavilion level has 17 audio logs the player can find, and only 8 of them aren't made by Dr. Steinman. While this sounds like a great opportunity for the other logs to introduce more lore on the other doctors and patients, Bioshock doesn't do this. The other 8 audio logs are random logs, like Andrew Ryan talking about the vandalism of vending machines or Dr. Shu Chong testing out a new plasmid. You could have put these anywhere else in the game and you wouldn't bat an eye, as they fit anywhere since their story isn't related to a specific area. It's not a bad decision to make these kind of audio logs, but it's clear that it makes it harder to fill the others with more content about the actual level. It makes the medical pavilion seem only about Dr. Steinman and not the other people in the pavilion. Thankfully, the environment does attempt to assist them in some ways, but the rest of the level lacks in any sort of story outside of Steinman. This also isn't a level issue, but more of a whole game issue sometimes. It always feels like the world revolves around specific key people and never anyone else. Our next level is a great example of the opposite, as Neptune's Bounty has no end boss. Well, sort of, and we'll get to that. Regardless, there are 19 audio logs in here, and there's a very diverse cast of characters within them, as most of them have between 3 to 5 logs each. On top of this, majority of the logs add to the level's ecosystem. Neptune's Bounty was used as a cover-up for a man named Frank Fontaine and his smuggling ring. Many items inside Rapture were considered contraband, as that would disrupt everything Rapture was built for, and a large majority of these audio logs aren't about one person, but the area as a whole, such as when Tenenbaum discovered that slug we talked about earlier. This links to the creation of Adam, but also adds to the level itself, as this discovery was found here. There's also an audio log about a man named Sullivan, who is a detective for Andrew Ryan, who's trying to find evidence against Fontaine. His audio logs show the steps during his case as he attempts to interrogate a smuggler of Fontaine's. We can actually find the location of where this interrogation happened in the level, and this also relates to the level as a whole again, as this is where Fontaine does his smuggling, so it would make sense that a detective would be here. This is the weird problem with Bioshock's audio logs, but I do want to make one thing very clear. I do not hate the concept of these logs. They're great ways of providing lore and world building to the game, even if they really shouldn't exist, as we discussed earlier. Plus, they're audio logs, not notes, meaning the player can walk around and explore the level while listening to it rather than sitting still and reading text. However, it's very clear that there is some favoritism and inconsistency with these audio logs, where one area will have most of the logs be about one character, another may have it be about the actual level, and sometimes it's neither. It can make the story harder to follow at times, as events may occur earlier than when they get explained, and can also be the opposite, where something gets explained but then is shown to the player later with the hopes that they remember it. Getting back to the actual story, Neptune's Bounty is the next level we come across, and as I said earlier, there is technically no boss in the level, at least Bioshock's version of a boss, as Peach Wilkins doesn't have that audio log treatment that many others got, like Dr. Steinman. He only gets 3 audio logs throughout the game, so it's clear he wasn't intended to be a boss or main character of an area, just a roadblock for the player to go around. This is further reinforced by him denying us access to Smuggler's hideout and subsequently Atlas's family until we can get him a research camera. camera. I'm not the only person to say this, but from a story and gameplay perspective, this camera is very video gamey. The fact that a camera is able to analyze genetic material from a simple picture is a possible stretch that I'm willing to just barely forgive, but it is in no way entertaining to start a fight with a camera so you can snapshot a picture of your enemy, then get back to fighting. At the end of the day, it's a really small part of the game, so I tend not to dwell on this too much. The fight that follows, though, has always been a blast to do, as it forces you to get creative with your plasmids. Incinerate can be used to open up more doorways, which double as cover and sources of EVE and ammo. Furthermore, you can make this encounter much more entertaining if you picked up the security bullseye from earlier, and don't even get me started about New Game Plus, as this makes this encounter even better. Peaches is a bullet sponge, however, and does take numerous hits to die from pretty much anything, but it does add to the intensity of the fight, so I didn't really mind it. After somehow making it out alive, we arrive at Smuggler's hideout where the Cora Fontaine smuggling ring is located. Despite it being the shortest level in Bioshock, it does an amazing job showing off its environment, as all these boxes we see throughout the level are the contraband Fontaine was smuggling in. We also do get to see a flashback appear on screen when we enter the area. This isn't the first time we've seen one, and it won't be the last, but it's relevant later, so we'll leave it for now. It's also here where we finally meet up with Atlas and help him rescue his family. We let Atlas through the door, and we watch as he attempts to free his family. Andrew Ryan comes on the radio and mocks us, saying maybe you could warn him, or if only you could do something except just stand there and watch him die. On its own, it's exactly as it sounds, but I've always found this to have a double meaning after knowing the ending of the game, but just like the flashbacks and the tons of other things we've talked about before today, we'll talk about that later. We run down the stairs to help Atlas, but he is overwhelmed by splicers and needs to fall back. But as we approach the sub to finish the job he started, it explodes in front of us. This is a turning point for the game. Atlas, the man who saved us and who we can consider to be a dear friend of ours, had just watched his family die in front of him. Atlas and now the player will want revenge for this, and the only person to enact that on is Andrew Ryan. That's why our next objective is to find the bathysphere in Rolling Hills, as this will take us right to Andrew Ryan himself. Our next level, Arcadia, is simultaneously where the middle of the game starts, and also where it starts to plummet in regards to the story. From a gameplay perspective, this is just like the previous levels, but with new plasmids, new enemies, more upgrades, and different environments. I thoroughly enjoyed the gameplay when going through these sections, but it carries the levels as there isn't much story to go off of. However, I will admit that there is the occasional audio log sprinkled in the next few levels that is very important to understanding the backstory of Rapture, and that there is a very unique sense of style to these places, as they all serve very unique purposes. Arcadia is a literal forest of trees, which is how Rapture is able to produce oxygen despite being hundreds of feet under the water. However, the majority of the audio logs in Arcadia are dedicated to one person, Julie Langford, the creator of the Arcadia Forest. Except she's not a main boss like Steinman. In fact, she helps us, which is a nice change of pace, but her audio logs don't really add much substance. One talks about her tests regarding this Lazarus device and how she wants to test the Rosa Gallica flower to see its result, but she was unable to due to a recent lockdown. If the bright colors and presentation weren't obvious, it's clear from the audio log that these flowers will be important later. Even if you didn't piece that together, she'll have you go fetch one anyway, so it doesn't matter if you caught on or not. Another talks about this cult within Arcadia called the Saturnine, except it's just about how they steal her equipment and how they believe they're touched by the gods. We do get to see this cult in the game, as all the Houdini splicers in Arcadia are a part of the group, but nothing else is developed. They're just a cult with no motivation and no real reason to exist, as from what we gather from the audio logs, they just drink human blood and plasmids, steal Julie's research materials, and are avoided by many of the people in Rapture as they brutally kill anyone who isn't a part of them. The question is, though, why? Well, if the wiki has anything to go off of, it was discovered that this cult was put into the game very late in development, and thus the devs ran out of time to add any proper backstory to them. While I will at least recognize that there was an attempt to add backstory, assuming that article is true, it wasn't present in the full release, thus I can only go off of what we have in-game. This same sort of storytelling, though, occurs all the way up until we meet Andrew Ryan, where there is that lack of substance in the audio logs save for a few key logs at specific points. Everything we have to do was made by the devs to add length to the game and extend its gameplay. Once again, taking everything into account, I don't mind this as the gameplay was fun, and I'll gladly take another couple hours of it, but when only looking at the story, it's clear we're being dragged along and constantly stalled for the sake of runtime. To get to Andrew Ryan from here, we need to get through Arcadia, except Andrew Ryan shuts off some of the oxygen, so we need to turn it back online with the help of Julie. To turn it on, we need to create the Lazarus vector Julie was working on, so we need to go from Arcadia to the farmer's market to grab the materials, then go back to Arcadia to put it together. We then have to hold out from a never-ending wave of splicers as they attempt to shut down the device. After this, we travel to Fort Frolic to find that bathysphere, only for the artist and serial killer Sander Cohen to interrupt us. After dealing with him, we make it to Hephaestus, a large industrial power plant where we can go to Andrew Ryan's office only for it to be locked. To turn off this electrical lock and get into his office, we need to blow up the power plant using a literal bomb. This takes around 4 or so hours to complete, which doesn't seem like a long time until you realize this campaign's runtime is close to 10 hours. That's also being extremely generous given the quality of the Bioshock remasters is awful and continues to crash, and this game doesn't have any consistent autosaves as they only trigger when you enter a new level, so assuming you get wrapped up in gameplay and forget to save like I did, you might be losing a couple minutes to a whole hour of progress. So if anything, it's actually less than 10 hours, but still it's clear that a large portion of the game is within these levels. Technically, you could argue that the first few levels do the exact same thing, as it does take quite a bit of time to get to Smuggler's Hideout, but not only are these levels short, as that whole sequence takes around half the time, the levels themselves are covered in numerous audio logs related to the area or the main boss of said area. We've already discussed before how Arcadia does attempt to do the same, but fails by not providing enough substance. The Farmer's Market suffers from the exact same fate as Arcadia, and Hephaestus has a couple important logs that are helpful to understanding the downfall of Rapture, but Fort Frolic and Sander Cohen are probably the only exception, as Sander Cohen is actually a really entertaining villain, and there is one extremely important audio log that has relevance to the end of the game. Sander Cohen is extremely creepy and also a bit sad at the same time. He's a poet, composer, sculptor, and playwright. He's clearly talented in the realm of art, but he too was subjected to the same problems many had thanks to Adam. Whereas Steinman became more infatuated with his work thanks to Adam as he attempted to erase all the problems he had, Sander Cohen would use this opportunity to also enhance his craft. He created artwork from his victims by covering them in plaster and setting them up in various poses. It's horrifying, especially when you discover that they're actual people as they bleed when you hit them. As I said, he's creepy and his mannerisms and speech reflect this too, but he's also quite the sad person, as his audio logs and even some dialogue from Andrew Ryan point to him seeing us as a spark he needed to keep going. The reason Sander Cohen keeps us here is that he needed help completing his masterpiece, a full 4-picture display of his colleagues who betrayed him next to a ton of bodies. It's our job to kill his colleagues and take their pictures. I do like how the pictures we take with the camera are the actual photos and not some preset photo the devs had in place, so nice touch. When we put the third photo in the picture frame, he freaks out, claiming that we are doubting his work. In his fit of rage, he has numerous spider splicers attack us. He calms down after a while and does apologize for the unnecessary outburst, but it's clear that he does not like people who dislike his work. By us helping Cohen and seeing his masterpiece through to the end, we can possibly give him the strength he needed to keep going with his artwork, and convey to him that he is indeed an excellent artist. It also seems that he may have planned to kill Andrew Ryan at some point, as one audio log says that he wants to create a requiem for him. It's also during this level where we uncover a very important scene of Jasmine Jolene, who we find out is Andrew Ryan's mistress, who's talking about her recent pregnancy.
So glad you didn't. I'm sorry, Mr. Ryan. I didn't know. I didn't know Fontaine had something to do with it. What are you doing? No, don't, please. I love you. Don't, please, no.
That creepy Dr. Tenenbaum promised me it wasn't gonna be a real pregnancy. They just take the egg out once Mr. Ryan and I had... Oh, I needed the money so bad. But I know Mr. Ryan's gonna suss it out. Gonna know I wasn't being careful. Gonna know I sold the... Mr. Ryan's gonna be so mad at me.
From what we gather, it seems that Andrew Ryan had discovered what occurred and beat her to death with a pipe. This incident, just like many we have discovered today, will be relevant later, but not too much later, as after running through the power plant, crafting the bomb, and destroying the power, we can finally come face to face with the man himself.
The assassin has overcome my final defense, and now he's come to murder me. In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys. You think you have memories. A farm. A family, an airplane, a crash, and then this place. Was there really a family? Did that airplane crash, or was it hijacked, forced down, Forced down by something less than a man, something bred to sleepwalk through life until they are activated by a simple phrase spoken by their kindly master. Was a man sent to kill, or a slave? A man chooses. A slave obeys. Come in. Stop, would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Sit, would you kindly? Stand, would you kindly? Run. Stop. Turn. A man chooses. A slave obeys. Kill! A man chooses! A slave obeys! Obey!
This is what makes Bioshock so hard to speak about, as so much of this game revolves around this key moment, and summarizing the journey here in just a few short sentences is a disservice to the effort that went into creating this plot twist. Right before this, we actually get to see a room that Andrew Ryan was working in, trying to piece together what was going on. He was confused why there was some random person who just happened to survive a plane crash right next to the entrance to Rapture and who is capable of defeating all that he throws at him. By the time we arrive, Ryan manages to uncover the truth. We're a sleeper agent for Atlas. We from birth were created to be this way. That child of Jasmine's that Tenenbaum took from her was us. She paid Jasmine for the baby and conditioned the child to respond to the phrase, "Would you kindly?" Meaning not only was Atlas lying to us, we the player never had any freedom in our choices, and to top it all off, we're Ryan's son. In some ways, it's almost poetic. Someone who preaches about men choosing and slaves obeying has a son who is the complete opposite of him, Ryan a man and his son a slave. As if this plot twist wasn't already bad enough, the game isn't done yet, as when we take Ryan's genetic key and put it into the override, we stop Rapture from self-destructing, but now give control of Rapture to Atlas, who is actually Frank Fontaine. This wouldn't have been as good if it was anyone but Fontaine. The one who ran the smuggling ring in Neptune's bounty, and the one who worked with Tenenbaum to condition us was the guy who saved us the whole time. That room from earlier also shows us some of the experiments Jack underwent before being sent out of Rapture, such as when Dr. Suchong forced us to snap a dog's neck because he said the phrase. Bioshock, without a doubt, has one of the best, if not the best, plot twist in gaming history. From the moment we have started the game, we had no free will. The present we were given sparked the plane crash, so even before we could play the game, we were being controlled. Video games as a whole give the player a choice. It could be small choices, like how to kill the enemy in front of you, or it could be a large choice like the ending of a game. But Bioshock took this idea and twisted it completely by tricking the player into thinking they had the freedom of choice, when in fact the only choice they were given was when to turn the game off. This revelation also ties into 4 things I've noticed over the years, and I've always wondered if they were intentional or not. Firstly, Jack has a tattoo of chains on his wrist, possibly signifying that he's a slave to Atlas. Next is when Atlas's family, who we eventually discovered didn't actually exist, blows up in the bathysphere. Andrew Ryan says maybe you could warn him, if only you could do something except just stand there and watch him die. At this time in the game, Ryan doesn't know who we are, so this wasn't intended to be a double meaning, but I believe the devs made him say this on purpose, as this line can be interpreted as us once again being a slave to Atlas with no way to do anything about it. Thirdly, when we meet the little sister at the medical pavilion, Atlas never says the words, "Would you kindly?" It's possible that not even Tenenbaum knew of Atlas's true true identity, and if he had said that phrase over the radio, she would have caught on immediately. This is something Fontaine tries to do throughout the story, and that's to play the long game. By convincing us that his family died in the bathysphere, we made our bond with him even stronger as we now have a common goal, but that's exactly what Fontaine wanted. The last thing I noticed was some symbolism in the first location minutes into the game, as there's a statue holding up a ball with the words "Welcome to Rapture" on it. This is easily a reference to Atlas, the Greek giant who was forced to hold up the world for all eternity. This could be seen as a foreshadowing of Atlas trying to hold up the world of Rapture by defeating Ryan and being the leader of the city, but it's also a reference to Atlas's demise, as in Greek mythology this was Atlas's punishment, so this could be foreshadowing Atlas's punishment in game as he just made us an enemy. All of these might be completely wrong, but the fact that they line up so well with the game's themes and story make it impossible to see it as a coincidence. From its plot twist to its symbolism, it's one of the best writing I've ever seen. However, we're still not done with the game yet. Fontaine has betrayed us, and without any real objective anymore, it's only fair that we enact the same revenge again, but on the man who actually deserves it. During the reveal of Fontaine, he says goodbye and launches an army of security bots to chase us. During our escape, a little sister appears and guides us to safety before falling down the vent shaft. We awake and then discover that we are in a secret room in Rapture where the little sisters relax and play together. It's a really cute moment as we can see all the little sisters interacting with one another. Tenenbaum then informs us that she was able to reduce some of the mental conditioning that Fontaine put on us, but we aren't completely cured. To achieve this, we need to head to Dr. Suchong's laboratory and find his cure for it. Fontaine, now the head of Rapture, notices that we're awake and attempts to shut us down, but only ends up being able to lower our health a bit by making our heart stop momentarily. It's a lot better than being completely manipulated, but he can still control us in some way, so we definitely need that cure. The location where this cure is found is a place called Olympus Heights, where all the super rich stayed in luxury apartments. Many characters we've already talked about today, like Tenenbaum, Dr. Suchong, and even Sandra Cohen lived in these apartments. I've always found it interesting how these apartments are right next to Apollo Square, which is known for housing the poor and homeless. You can even tell from the railroad station next to each area, as the area near Olympus Heights is quite pristine given the circumstances, and the one in Apollo Square is extremely run down. Both the audio logs and the environment will tell us that there was clearly a revolution starting here, and at the head of this was Atlas. In order to avoid suspicion and hide under the radar, Fontaine faked his own death and changed his name and face to Atlas. We learn in Arcadia that Atlas was at one point a politician, but he claimed those days were over. It seemed that Fontaine was using the poor as his army, and there is numerous audio logs to back this theory up. Andrew Ryan wanted to create the perfect society, but it fell victim to social status, and given his own policies within Rapture, there wasn't much opportunity to crawl back to the middle class. Those who were rich succeeded, and those who were poor suffered, just like every other society in existence. Fontaine sees this opportunity to gather an army of like-minded individuals and use them to do his bidding. Going back to Neptune's bounty, we have a couple audio logs from Peaches that talk about how he disliked Ryan and preferred Fontaine's way of running things, at least initially, until he realized that Fontaine might actually be worse than Ryan. This really shows that even Rapture was doomed to fail as a society. The only way it was possible to save this city was for Ryan to help the poor and make sure everyone was happy, but given his own beliefs and the beliefs of Rapture, that was never going to happen. The downfall of Rapture didn't happen overnight. It was a long string of events that progressively got worse and worse. The Atom addiction, the mistreatment of the poor, the manipulation of Fontaine, the actual culture surrounding Rapture, all of it contributed to its demise. Getting back to the story, we end up finding the cure for our mental conditioning and allowed Jack complete freedom for the first time in his life. One thing that's important to note is his freedom, because it's not like he was completely controlled. He still did things in his life before coming to Rapture, but he was never completely free, as Fontaine could easily change that by saying one simple phrase. While gathering the cure, we also found a dead body on the table and discovered that it's Dr. Suchong's. Quite ironic that Dr. Suchong died to his own creation. He was, of course, the original creator of the Big Daddies and was the one who created that defense mechanism in them that attacks anyone who hurts the little sisters. Good to see that he's dead, given how much pain he caused people. After finding the cure, we can now kill Fontaine, except before we get a chance to, he locks the door of the educational facility, which is only unlocked via a Big Daddy, which means we need to become a Big Daddy. Despite how bothersome this area can be in regards to its confusing layout and plethora of enemies, from a lore perspective, it's quite intriguing, as this is the facility where the Big Daddies and Little Sisters were made. One thing that's been missing from this game so far is who the Big Daddies are and how they were made, and thankfully this area answers that question. It seems that the Big Daddies are people who had their skin and organs grafted to the suits, which may explain why they can't take them off. In Jack's case, he didn't need to graft his skin and organs to the suit, as he just needed to trick the system into thinking he was a Big Daddy, which is why he isn't injured during the process. However, he does need a voice module so he can sound like one, and just by looking at the device, it definitely doesn't look safe. After becoming a Big Daddy, we help out a little sister who gives us a syringe and unlocks the final locked door to Fontaine, where we can now finally start the boss fight, and both this and the endings of Bioshock are honestly quite bad. Fontaine is a giant creature now flowing with Adam, and while I'm willing to just barely believe something like this is possible, the fight overall is just bad. All you do during the fight is shoot him until his health is gone, and then when he returns to his machine to gather more Adam, you stab him with the syringe, and you do this 4 times until he dies. You would think after the second time he would stop recharging his Adam this way, but apparently not. The boss fight does ramp up in difficulty as the security bots and splicers come to his aid, but it's sort of hard to ignore the giant naked man trying to kill you, especially when he functions just like a Big Daddy and stuns you when you're hit. After defeating him, he'll smack you one more time, and all the little sisters will come out and aid you by stabbing him, which admittedly is pretty cool. Afterward, the game goes into one of 3 endings, and the conditions of the ending depend on whether or not you harvested or saved the little sisters. One ending is when you save all of them, the other is when you harvest all of them, and a third is if you do a mix of both. You don't need to rescue every single little sister, but out of the ones you interacted with within the game, you do have to save them. I do like the happy ending where all the little sisters grow up and live normal lives before all meeting again to be with you on your deathbed, but the other is just bizarre as Jack takes control of Rapture for himself and uses the splicers as an army to overtake the surface and launch a nuke? Like, the ending started okay, but ramped up in intensity immediately. Why does Jack need a nuke? Why bother killing those on the surface? What was even the point of this ending? This, just like the morality of harvesting and rescuing the little sisters, was something the developers wish they had improved on for the final release. Regardless, we have made it to the end of the game and thus finished the story of Bioshock. This game is without a doubt one of the best of all time. It truly has one of the best stories in the gaming industry and is one I wish I could experience again for the first time. Bioshock has an incredible level of detail put into its story, from its world building to its story of specific characters. This, coupled with its incredible plot twist, makes this a very hard game to beat when it comes to comparing its stories. It's one game I will always recommend without hesitation and was the perfect start to a brand new series. Bioshock 2 is perfection. It took what was wrong with Bioshock 1 and changed it for the better, but it also kept its strongest narrative devices in the game, making it feel like how a Bioshock game should. This ultimately created a perfect version of Bioshock that I feel doesn't get enough credit, so today I want to discuss why I think that. Without further ado, let's get started. As always, we need to start at the beginning. A cutscene showcases that we are in 1958. If you recall from the lore, that is only a year before the New Year's attacks in 1959. So currently, things should be quite civil, and for the most part they are. We see a first-person view of a Big Daddy talking with a little sister, to which he follows her around the halls. She ends up running on ahead before getting caught by some thugs. Just like any Big Daddy would, he decimates the thugs with ease before being hypnotized. Afterwards, though, a woman named Sophia Lamb enters the room.
There we are. He's perfectly safe now. This is not your daughter. Do you understand? Her name is Eleanor, and she is mine. Now, kneel, please. Remove your helmet. Now, take the pistol. Place it against your head. Fire.
Honestly, it's a great intro, and we can learn a lot from it. Firstly, while walking with the little sister, we get a sneak peek at the Big Daddy guiding her, and it's a model we haven't seen yet in the series. On top of that, the little girl has a name, Eleanor. Throughout the series, we aren't told little sister's name, so this was done intentionally to paint her as an important character. Even further, we actually see the Big Daddy remove his helmet. This is also a first for the series. As we know, Big Daddies were regular people who had modifications done to their bodies so they could fit the role of the Big Daddy, such as voice modification, mental conditioning, and the grafting of the skin to the suit itself. But this doesn't seem to be the case. The only character who's capable of doing this is Jack in Bioshock 1, but as we know, he only needed to seem like a Big Daddy so he could bypass the facility's lockdown. If you want to see more of this, I did talk about Bioshock 1 in a previous video, which will be linked at the end of this one or in the eye in the top right now. So questions are already flooding the player's mind, and it's enough to either get them hooked immediately or at least get their attention. Mind you, this is only 3 minutes into the game, so we're starting off quite strong. Bioshock 1 had the element of surprise, as the player wasn't accustomed to Rapture just yet. That's why its sudden reveal landed so well, but doing that again wouldn't have the same effect, so Bioshock 2 needed to ramp up the intensity. And not only does the intro start off incredibly strong, it keeps going as the character we play throughout the game is a Big Daddy. Words can't describe how excited I was when seeing this. There is no doubt in my mind that at least once throughout a playthrough of Bioshock 1, you must have thought how cool it would have been to play as one. Well, our prayers have been answered, as playing as the Big Daddy is arguably the greatest feeling in the series. From the actual moment-to-moment gameplay to the interactions with the little sisters, the Big Daddy is such a great character for the player to control. As if all of this wasn't great already, the game introduces the newest character to the roster, the Big Sister. These two represent a sort of dichotomy, battling over a common goal. Quite early in the game, we take our first plasmid and come across a little sister. Since we're a Big Daddy, our duty is to obviously protect her, except the Big Sister swipes her away from us. The problem is that the Big Sisters were designed to also protect the Little Sisters. So firstly, where did she even come from? But secondly, why are they actively working against us despite having a common goal? Bioshock as a series has never shielded away from secrecy, mystery, and confusion, especially in its early moments. Already within just a few minutes, we're given multiple breadcrumb trails, and while not forced to follow said trail, why wouldn't you after going through this intro? Who is the Big Sister? Who are we? Why aren't we a normal Big Daddy? Who is Eleanor, and who is Sophia Lamb? These questions are the driving force behind why the player continues deeper into the game. Bioshock 2 had a tough job of continuing the series after the very satisfying conclusion of the previous game. It also had to get the player interested despite giving all of its secrets away in that previous game, and somehow Bioshock 2 nailed it perfectly. Some games have been able to pull this off before, but only few have been truly able to do this within a couple minutes of game time, and the fact that Bioshock 2 can replicate the same mysterious feeling of Bioshock 1 with the added penalty of having its vast world building already known by the player deserves some praise. So now that I'm done rambling about the game's mystery, I think it's time to finally explain that mystery. I've always been a sucker for lore in games if it wasn't evident by the videos on this channel, and Bioshock 2's newly added concepts and world building are utterly brilliant. Just like Bioshock 1, the majority of the story will come from audio diaries, random devices we can find throughout the world. However, Bioshock 1 ran into an issue with these devices. Many of the audio diaries focused on key characters, whether that was the main boss of an area like Dr. Steinman, or was a part of Rapture's high society like Tenenbaum and Andrew Ryan. It felt like Rapture only revolved around a few people, and that never sat right with me. Bioshock 2 changes this completely, as while some notable characters will have numerous appearances throughout the game, like Sophia Lamb, Andrew Ryan, and Tenenbaum, there's also a large number of audio logs made by just random people who had way more world building than Bioshock 1 ever did. We'll circle back to him in a moment, but a good example is Mark Meltzer. His audio diaries detail his investigation into Rapture and his daughter Sydney, as he believes his daughter was kidnapped and brought here for an unknown reason. Originally, it seems like just a one-off diary, but not only does just this one diary explain that people from the surface have found and invaded Rapture, but he has more diaries that show up throughout the game, and it makes you want to see the outcome of his investigation. Like I said, even if it was just a one-off diary, the fact that people like Mark can even find Rapture is incredible to begin with. Rapture was built to be away from society both far and deep enough that only those who were invited would know, yet somehow random people are able to find it, and that's a big issue. Just this one diary finally provided an astronomical amount of world building and makes Rapture feel like a living, breathing city. Besides the miscellaneous audio diaries, a good portion of them still deal with a lot of information that is necessary to understanding what's going on. So the intro was in 1958, but the game actually takes place 10 years later in 1968. We are Subject Delta and Alpha Series Big Daddy. Not only are we a part of the first line of Big Daddies, but we're the first ever Big Daddy to be bonded with a little sister. On top of this, being an Alpha Series is quite different than being a regular Big Daddy. Firstly, Alpha Series Big Daddies don't have the skin grafted to their suit, which explains why Delta could take off his helmet in the intro. Furthermore, the Alpha Series is only intended to bond with one little sister. During their creation, the person inside the suit was fitted with an unbreakable psychological bond with one little sister. Should this bond be broken by the death of the little sister or the separation of the two for an extended period of time, the Alpha Series will either collapse and enter a coma-like state or be driven mad with rage. One of the audio diaries even talks about someone seeing one of the Alpha Series Big Daddies crying at a gatherer's garden because they couldn't find their little sister. This idea clearly had many drawbacks, as the Big Daddies would be completely useless should the little sister die. This is why they changed to the typical Big Daddies we see more frequently in Bioshock 1. Ones who still protect the little sisters but don't have a specific bond with a particular one, making them a bit more useful. This unbreakable bond we just discussed is why Delta is so adamant on finding Eleanor when he awakes, but clearly he wasn't just a suit of armor all his life, as we know all Big Daddies were humans at some point. In Delta's case, he was just a deep-sea diver on the surface who accidentally came across Rapture. He actually had an article written in the paper about him. Ryan didn't believe this story and thought that he was a spy, so he had him incarcerated. His old life would then come to an end when he was selected to be a part of the Big Daddy program, leaving his old name and identity behind, being only known as Delta. After the cutscene in the intro, Delta wakes up after the events of Bioshock 1, so Andrew Ryan and Fontaine are already dead. The first words we hear upon waking up are from a familiar voice: Tenenbaum. It seems that even though Rapture is practically a barren wasteland, she decided to stay behind, or at least that's what it seems like. Tenenbaum actually came back to Rapture thanks to Sophia Lamb. Rapture is an extremely captivating place, not just in ideals, but in location. Substitute out that objectivism that Andrew Ryan prodded into the city and swap that with literally anything and you can get a ultimate utopia of that ideal. Rapture is a secluded place away from the rest of the world, so literally anything involved with Rapture could have blossomed from such a location, like, let's say, a cult. Rapture in Bioshock 2 is now under new management, with Sophia Lamb being the leader who has rallied the people behind the banner of the family. You may actually recognize Sophia, as throughout the first game there was a poster showing Rapture's best and brightest, and in the back resides Sophia. Before and during her time in Rapture, she was a clinical psychiatrist. Andrew Ryan had invited her to Rapture so that she could provide counseling to the isolated members of Rapture. Overall, it sounded like a great deal for both parties involved, but Sophia quickly realized that the cause of this problem was the person who hired her to solve it, Andrew Ryan. See, Rapture under Ryan was built around objectivism, something I had completely neglected to bring up in the previous video, so thank you all in the comments for mentioning that to me. Objectivism is defined as, quote, the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. But Sophia had a more altruistic look on life, as she had hoped to enlighten the citizens of Rapture through a common good. She would do this by providing free therapy to the poor and intentionally losing at poker so she could spread her wealth to the less fortunate. Andrew Ryan actively wanted the people to push themselves and seek their true greatness on their own without anyone hindering their progress, but Sophia was actively going against that by helping others. This caused the two to clash heads on multiple occasions, even having live debates on specific topics. And it was also during this time that Sophia was actively helping the poor, and Fontaine was also trying to undermine Ryan using Fontaine futuristics. So when it was discovered that both Fontaine and Ryan were dead, it made sense that she became the newest owner. Her altruistic outlook on life also helped her gain that favor, as the people of Rapture saw her as a kind woman willing to help those who were less fortunate. But she knew this wouldn't last. She would either be overtaken by some other force of nature, or she would die from natural causes. So to continue her goals, she ended up teaching her daughter in hopes of becoming her perfect vessel. Eleanor is her daughter. Yes, the little sister that Delta had bonded with is none other than the new Queen of Rapture's daughter. It's such a great twist, and it raises the stakes of our missions tenfold. So far, this is the story of Rapture in Bioshock 2, but I've neglected to bring up Tenenbaum. As I said, Tenenbaum did leave Rapture, and so did all the little sisters, but she discovered that more girls were disappearing, so she came back to Rapture to find out someone was making little sisters again, so she came down here to put an end to it. As you remember, Tenenbaum was the creator of the little sisters, but after she realized the pain and suffering this caused, she regretted her actions and dedicated her time to stopping what she created, but now she has to do it all over again. This is the full, complete backstory that sets the foundation of Bioshock 2. It's quite a lot and can get complex at times, but this is exactly what I was looking for. I wanted Bioshock 2 to take the already established story of Bioshock 1 and make that the foundation for the sequel, and this integration exceeded my expectations. So far, we've been getting a little ahead of ourselves, so let's dial it back a bit and continue where we left off in game. Currently, we're still in the early minutes of the game, and already Sophia's cult-like following is starting to show itself, as there are paintings, tributes, and murals dedicated to her. There's no shortage of these in Bioshock 2. Truly showing how far her influence goes in Rapture, and alternatively how alone and outnumbered we are again. Accompanying these tributes is a book called Unity and Metamorphosis. It's all about the creation of a perfect paradise through unity and the abandonment of the self. This also coincides with all the imagery and messages of butterflies and being reborn, just as a caterpillar is reborn into a butterfly. A butterfly is vastly different compared to a caterpillar, which is why it's considered two different insects despite being the same thing. Sophia planned on using Eleanor as a vessel for her ideologies by basically shutting her away from the world while she teaches her. She would then show the family Eleanor and how she is the first utopian who is able to abandon herself and become truly free. The problem is that Sophia has to convince the rest of Rapture to do the same, and while many are on her side, aligning yourself with her is a lot different than changing your way of thinking permanently. Thankfully, depending on how you look at it, Sophia did find a rather interesting discovery. Sophia discovered the story of Jack and realized that this mental conditioning could be used to make people uphold the common good. This proves that Sophia is just as flawed as everyone else. She is literally following in the footsteps of Fontaine and is considering using a type of conditioning that reprograms the brain and forces people not to think for themselves. Just like we talked about before, this is another example of Bioshock 2 taking key parts from the previous game and reworking it in the sequel. Now the phrase "would you kindly" isn't seen as a way to manipulate someone to do your bidding, but it's seen as a necessary step to be able to live freely in a utopia. It's these slight twists on already familiar material that makes the story very engaging again. Continuing through the level, we finally get to face off against the Big Sister, and it's here and a few other places later in the game via audio diaries where we discover where these Big Sisters came from. These Big Sisters were originally Little Sisters. The atom in their body became too problematic as they grew older, and thus the older sisters were moved into different roles. We also find out that it was the Big Sisters who were abducting the new Little Sisters from the surface, which explains the vast population of Little Sisters still in Rapture again. There isn't any other lore besides this, but it does answer a fairly good question in regards to what happens when the sisters get older. Irrational Games could have easily just said that because Rapture is so large we didn't rescue all the little sisters, thus why they're still populating the city, but this approach to its world building was a much better choice, so nice job. As we approach the end of the first area, we encounter Sophia for the first time, very similarly to how we encounter Ryan, except instead of Atlas trying to help us, it's Tenenbaum. She then explains that she can help us get to Eleanor as she can see through the camera in our helmets, except I'm not really even sure why they brought this up as it's never used again. We meet Tenenbaum one time in person, and then afterwards we never hear another word from her. We get more info on her whereabouts and time in Rapture from audio diaries again, which is a shame as these audio diaries tell us a lot of important information that I would have loved for her to elaborate on. Now, to be fair, these audio logs are in the DLC, which we'll talk about later, but still, I wish that she would have had much more of an appearance this game. Instead, we're going to be guided by Augustus Sinclair, and I 100% blame Bioshock 1 for this because I did not trust him the entire game. He fills the exact same role as Atlas, a guy we don't know who just wants to help us for seemingly no reason. But the whole time he was talking, I was just waiting for him to backstab us, but it never came true. Upon entering the second area, we hear Eleanor's voice and discover that she can talk to us telepathically and is actively trying to aid us by bringing us gifts and plasmids. It's not clear how she can do this, but it's explained later. One thing you'll notice from playing this game is the lack of levels in Bioshock 2. The game only has 9 areas compared to its predecessor's 14, and while that's not a large difference, it's still a lesser amount, but what Bioshock 2 lacks in quantity, it makes up for in quality. Each of these levels is 3, 4, or 5 levels high, filled with rubble, objects, enemies, and other gear for the player to look at. These places feel lived in and real, which is always a nice feeling. You'll be spending much more time in these levels individually than compared to Bioshock 1. Both games did take me around the same time to complete, yet one game had less levels than the other, meaning I was spending more time in those levels engaging with the environment and dealing with puzzles and all the enemies it threw at me. Bioshock 1 also did feel quite linear at times. Places like the Proving Grounds and the Medical Pavilion were great, but some of the levels felt way too linear for the genre. All of the levels in Bioshock 2 are completely non-linear. You'll be constantly backtracking to the same places, and not only does this add to the gameplay loop of finding new enemies in the same locations, but it also plays into the story and how it's continually trying to reinforce how large these areas within Rapture are and how expansive this city really is. My only complaint is the odd amount of similarity between some of the levels, as sometimes it's hard to determine what level you're really on besides a few specific areas. Bioshock 1 really nailed the diversity of the level-to-level gameplay to where no level really looked the same. I will admit though that this is quite the subjective stance. However, something that is objectively better than before is the way the game handles the Little Sisters. In our last video talking about Bioshock 1, I mentioned that while on paper the choice of saving and harvesting the Little Sisters was cool, in practice it was extremely one-sided, as it favored rescuing the Little Sisters, thus ruining the choice of morality. Bioshock 2 reduces the number of Little Sisters from 21 down to 12. On top of this, rescuing the Little Sister requires you to defeat the Big Daddy protecting her, then escort her to 2 bodies in the level to extract Adam from. Once that's done, only then can you rescue them. This is made way more difficult thanks to Bioshock Bioshock 2's Amp difficulty. The game isn't impossible, but you start out with a max of 5 EVE and health slots rather than your 9 in Bioshock 1. Your weapons also don't feel nearly as powerful sometimes, and enemies do hit a lot harder, plus there's also more Big Daddies, as you'll be constantly fighting more Alpha Series versions as we get closer to the game's epilogue. Furthermore, every 4 little sisters that you rescue or harvest will spawn a big sister, who, while does drop 40 Adam, is without a doubt the hardest enemy in the game. After everything is all said and done, upon looking at the numbers, the actual difference isn't that far off. It's actually less than the previous game, with a difference of 90 Adam according to the wiki, but the tasks required to get that Adam makes harvesting seem like the much better option. As if all of this wasn't bad enough already, something we discover from the audio logs later in the game is that the little sisters, despite being immortal, do experience some degree of pain, as one fell over a railing and broke her leg, and when they tried to snap it back into place, it was clear from her facial reactions that she was experiencing pain. Makes you think about the next time you unload a few rockets near her when you try to take down the Big Daddy. Relating back to the story, this is what Irrational Games had intended for the first game, giving the player an easy but morally wrong option and a hard but morally right option to see if it's enough to break the player's values. Is the struggle to hold off waves of splicers enough to make you snap and just take the Atom for yourself by force? This idea also makes the ending much more important, but we'll get to that later. The fourth area of the game is Pauper's Drop, and is our first instance of a boss-like character similar to Dr. Steinman from Bioshock 1. In this area, we have Grace Holloway, who runs this section of Rapture and is eagerly waiting to kill us. According to the audio logs we find about her, Grace was a singer here in Rapture who caught the eye of a James who was enjoying her singing. He seemed to enjoy when people were real when it came to Rapture and willing to talk about its flaws. This caused him to be noticed by Ryan and then taken away, never to be heard of again. She would then hear of Sophia Lamb and how she was giving away free counseling and then was swindled into her family. She joined her group of people, and because of how important she was to Sophia, when Ryan eventually came for Sophia and locked her up in prison, she gave Eleanor to Grace so that she may look after her. However, this didn't last long, as Eleanor was kidnapped and sold to the Little Sisters orphanage, which explains how she became a Little Sister in the first place. Once she became a Little Sister, she would then bond to us, and we would then become her current guardian. This explains why Grace is extremely mad at our arrival in Pauper's Drop, claiming that we stole Eleanor from her. The reason this is relevant is because all of this information is key to understanding her character and thus determining her fate at the end of the level. Bioshock 2 introduces the option of killing or sparing 3 key people, and our first is Grace Holloway. When you enter Grace's quarters, you're given the choice of killing or sparing her. It's quite easy to just kill her and leave since she started fighting you, but given her backstory, I ultimately decided to spare her. She was just a poor and lost woman down in Rapture, and when Sophia was able to bring her out of her own hell, of course she was going to help her as much as she could. Plus, we can't blame her for not understanding the bond between Eleanor and Delta. Neither wanted to become Little Sisters or Big Daddies. Even as an Alpha Series model, yes, your skin isn't grafted to the suit, but you're still heavily spliced with Adam. And of course, as we know, most if not all the Big Daddies were unwilling participants. We never chose this life, but Grace doesn't know that, so we can't blame her for trying to kill us. If you spare her, she goes on to say that she was wrong about you. She still believes that Sophia isn't a liar, but she knows that she is at least wrong about Delta. Our second character is Stanley Poole at Diana's Park. Still continuing to be altruistic, Sophia also had a hand in the creation of the park, which served as both an art and cultural exhibit hosted by Sophia herself. She created this as both a way for her to undermine Ryan's ideals and also a way to promote her own. Ryan's main philosophy with Rapture was a city without morals or censors, so naturally all art should be accepted in Rapture, until Sophia started using this against him and started showcasing art opposite of Ryan's ideology. This of course led to her art being censored by the general public, showing that Rapture was a place that accepted these qualities, but as long as Ryan agreed to it. To make matters worse for Ryan, his own version of this was Arcadia from Bioshock 1, except Ryan charged his visitors, whereas Sophia made this exhibit free to the public. Due to this attack on his character, Ryan had enough of Lamb and sent a spy to infiltrate her network. This spy was Stanley Poole. Stanley was quite successful in feeding information to Ryan, but so much so that it led to Sophia being imprisoned. He would then during this time use the money Sophia had to throw parties at the park in an attempt to eradicate her funds. However, during this time, Eleanor caught wind of these parties and confronted Stanley about it. Fearing he would be caught, he was the one who kidnapped Eleanor and gave her up to the Little Sisters orphanage. In the present day, Stanley has flooded the exhibit, fearing that Sophia and the other members in the family would rat him out as Ryan's spy. He stays held up in there for years until Delta arrives at the park. While we're only here to just pass by and get to Fontaine Futuristics, Stanley refuses to let us pass until we deal with all the Little Sisters. Despite all the witnesses being dead, Stanley fears that when the Little Sisters drain the victim's Adam, they'll discover the truth and relay the info back to Sophia. So he wants us to get rid of them, but by helping the Little Sisters, we can also uncover the full story for ourselves. What is shown is the info we just previously went over with him kidnapping kidnapping Eleanor and throwing massive parties at Sophia's expense. When we approach Stanley, Sophia hops on the microphone and says that he is the reason we're a Big Daddy and that she knew for years that he was a spy. We are now once again given the option of killing or sparing him. This decision was probably the hardest one for me to do. Stanley is responsible for our new life, but he wasn't the only one at fault. He wrote the article about Delta being the mysterious deep-sea diver. The article didn't seem like it was malicious. Ryan was the only one who saw Delta as a threat, so the blame now goes to Ryan. But Ryan just simply imprisoned us. It was Sinclair who would then offer us a job at Fontaine Futuristics as a performer who tested plasmids in front of a live audience. These performances made him a candidate for the Big Daddy program, so Sinclair is now to blame. But Dr. Sue Chong and Gilbert Alexander created the Big Daddy program, so they're to blame as well. Do you see where this is going? No one person is truly responsible for Delta's new life. It was just coincidence after coincidence, and he was just at the wrong places at the wrong time, every time. You could, however, claim that because he hurt Eleanor and turned her into a little sister, he should be punished, but this argument is quite shallow. All of these decisions that happened between us and Eleanor led to us being bonded together, but if something changed, then we could have been bonded with someone else. Say we arrived later or even earlier to Rapture, then Eleanor would have likely never bonded with us. So there is no argument in saying that we should harm Stanley for how we treated Eleanor, because not only did we not know her even prior to our own transformation, you could technically even argue that we should be grateful to him for bringing us together, although I don't really subscribe to that idea either. Despite this, there is a lot of reasons to not spare him, and that is because of his other actions like killing the witnesses and clearly showing that he'll do whatever it takes, including murder, to get his way. It's due to this confliction that I ultimately decided to spare Stanley. He wasn't the sole reason we're a Big Daddy, and the idea that we should harm him for what he did to Eleanor makes no sense either. Our third and final character is Gilbert Alexander. His introduction starts off quite different than what we're used to, as we hear an audio recording tell us to kill him, and then we see him piloting a security bot all while yelling at a group of splicers. This is quite the twist, as we have a man who is telling us to kill him because he's going to become clinically insane, but then also having that new insane self tell us not to kill him. It's also during this level where we can meet Mark Meltzer, the guy who investigated Rapture so he could find his daughter, or at least what was left of him anyway. It seems that despite all he went through, he was caught by Sophia and turned into a Big Daddy. On the plus side, however, according to the audio log that was found in his body, the little sister he bonded with was his daughter Cindy, so at least they got to be together forever, well, at least until we killed him. You don't discover that this is Mark until after his death, which makes you feel quite sad as you just tore his daughter from him, so I made it up to Mark by restoring his daughter to her former self in hopes that she can have a brighter future. It's incredible how Bioshock makes you care about Mark and Cindy, despite them rarely ever showing up. You know what happens to the little girls in Rapture, so that makes the situation even worse as we now finally got to see the other side of the coin. We're now able to see how the parents react to their daughter being taken. Bioshock 1 did this as well with another individual, but I felt it was much better handled here. Going back to Gilbert, since we have to decide his fate, the question is then, what's his story? Well, Gilbert Alexander was a researcher at Rapture who specialized in robotic and mechanical engineering. He was also the creator of the Alpha Series Big Daddies and was responsible for the unbreakable bond that they have built into them. As we know, it worked too well, making them not as efficient in protecting all the little sisters as it only made them care about one. This idea was inevitably thrown out, but due to his knowledge of the bonding process and the manufacturing of the suits, he assisted Dr. Sue Chong in creating the new line of Big Daddies. After some time, though, he began to feel guilty about his actions. Sophia used this skill to manipulate him into being her own test subject.
Dr. Alexander has agreed to accept both measures of the new utopian project. He will become a kind of genetic chimera, host to all the minds of Rapture, accessing their talents and memories via the Adam we have gathered. And, deriving in part from Project WYK, I have developed a new set of behavioral constraints. Dr. Alexander will live to promote the common good.
She wanted to use Gilbert as a test subject to see if she could create the first utopian being capable of losing self-interest and being extremely loving and loyal to the human race. This, however, did not go as planned.
I was to be Sophia Lamb's greatest achievement, a living composite of all Rapture's genius in the body of a single man, unfettered by self-interest. Now, I am nothing more to her than a failed experiment. My scores on tests of intelligence and moral reasoning are still noteworthy, but declining sharply. She has abandoned me, and I do not have long before psychosis takes me.
This is what led to Gilbert making the audio logs we hear about how to kill him once he becomes insane. After entering the core of Fontaine Futuristics, we can see him in his final form, which is this giant amalgamation inside of a water tank. It looks awful. We then for the final time have to decide another person's fate. This is the only person in the game I killed, and I also killed without hesitation. I deemed it as a mercy killing more than anything. This does become quite the tough argument when you consider that it's possible that after being clinically insane, he enjoyed his new life, and thus killing him would have been a bad thing. It's ultimately his words against his own, and personally I'd rather believe the version that was able to think more rationally rather than the one that was mutated beyond human recognition. That's why I felt that it was a good idea to kill him so I could rid him of his suffering and allow him to finally die. As a whole, these choices were really well done, and judging from some of the community discussions I've seen, many have chosen the alternate solutions that I didn't choose. I read many posts saying that they killed Grace Holloway for trying to fight them, that they killed Stanley for turning us into a big daddy, and some even spared Gilbert because they believed that his past self wants to die but his present self doesn't want to, and thus they spared him. This shows that these choices were well written enough that it wasn't clear what the best choice was in the moment. It makes you think about your decision and what led to things being like how they are now, and that's once again extremely impressive. After dealing with Gilbert, we make it to Persephone, which is Rapture's prison system and is also where we find Eleanor. As we approach her, Sophia stops us and locks us out. She goes on to explain that Eleanor wanted a father and tried to make one again. An audio log clears this up, but basically Eleanor has the power to control the little sisters, and through this power she managed to find a gene sample of Delta. She planned on using this sample to revive Delta through a Vita chamber, and sure enough, it worked. This explains how we survived the gunshot wound. We didn't actually survive, Eleanor just revived us. She also used the little sisters to contact Tenenbaum so that she could help us get back up on our feet. Now things are starting to make a bit more sense, but just as we're about to be let inside, Sophia smothers Eleanor with a pillow, temporarily stopping us due to our unbreakable bond. However, it was only for a specific amount of time, as Sophia obviously wants to keep Eleanor alive, as that's literally her daughter, so it wasn't enough time to kill her, but it was enough to break our bond with her. When we awake, we're strapped down and can't move, but Eleanor lets us take control of one of the little sisters so that we can unlock our own restraints. As simple as this sequence was, it was probably one of my favorites in the entire game, as we got to see the world through the eyes of the little sister for the very first time, and it truly shows how deep the mental conditioning went. They don't even see the same world that we do, it's completely different. This was more than likely made so that the girls didn't have to see the horrors of the real world and thus can continue to do their jobs without being scared. This explains why everything is so clean and new in their world, and why the big sister suit isn't a diving suit but a dress, and why there's petals instead of blood. When we do extract the blood from the splicers though, it does cut back to the real world, and I don't think this happens to the girls. I think it's just more of a game design decision to remind us that we're still in Rapture, meaning the girls after becoming little sisters never see the real world again until we save them. This was such a great section and really shows how badly their minds were altered. After using the little sister to gather the big sister suit, we give it to Eleanor, who uses it to break out of her containment and then release us as well. We also get a plasmid that can summon her from any location, which is really cool as it shows Sophia that despite the bond being physically broken, their love for one another knows no bounds. By talking with Eleanor, we discover that she has a plan, which is to take Sinclair's lifeboat up to the surface, except Sophia is trying to stop us. While trying to thwart her plans at stopping us, we run into Sinclair again, except time this is not on good terms. It seems that he was captured and made into a big daddy. We can hear his voice over the radio getting more and more desperate as he tries to find a way out of the suit. He then tells us to unlock the door and finish him off. Even though he desperately wanted to live and be on the surface again, dying is better than being a controlled test subject. After getting the device from Sinclair and also helping Eleanor rescue the little sisters that are in the nearby wing, we use the little sisters by having them boil the water underneath the lifeboat so it can rise. I'll be honest, I don't remember if this was ever explained in the entire series ever, but the only thing I can assume is that they're expelling the atom in their systems, which heats the water somehow. As we finish heating the lifeboat, the explosives that Sophia planted explode and cause us to get knocked back. Thankfully, we're just barely able to latch onto the lifeboat as it floats up, and it's here where we discover the ending of the game, but it's done a bit differently this time. There are 6 possible endings, but it's all because of the combination of 2 choices. The harvesting and rescuing from Bioshock 1 returns again, but the sparing and killing of the previous characters is also a factor. There's actually a neat little flowchart someone made to help visualize them. Sparing lives actually has different weight depending on your choices with the little sisters. If you spared all the girls, then saving one character will give you the best ending, but if you harvest a couple of the little sisters, then you must spare all of them to get that same ending. This goes even further with the bad ending, as when you harvest all the little sisters, sparing the 3 characters is still not enough, enough, and then you're stuck in the bad ending. Now this is only for determining whether or not Sophia lives. The other decision is Eleanor and Delta's fate. If you rescue all the little sisters, then Eleanor will drain Delta's atom and transfer it into her so that his memories and consciousness can live inside of her and the two can be together forever. If you harvest all the little sisters, Eleanor shows no remorse and drains all of his atom for herself, killing Delta, as she says that we taught her not to let things go to waste. However, these endings are different from Bioshock 1, and not just in the actual cutscenes, but it's how it's determined. Remember, Eleanor can control and look through the eyes of the little sisters. Because of this, she was able to witness all the rescuing and harvesting we did to them, as well as the decisions we made regarding the 3 important people we discussed before. And it's these decisions that play into the ending of the game. Whereas Bioshock 1 had a similar structure which changed the ending based on our decisions with the sisters, it's not outlandish to find this a bit odd, as some could have simply just used the sisters for extra atom to survive Rapture and had no intentions of taking the girls for themselves or using them in the splicers to rule Rapture. But with Bioshock 2, your decisions don't affect you but your own daughter. Just as a parent can influence their child's behavior, we as the parent influenced Eleanor's outlook on life, such as whether or not people should be forgiven for their past mistakes, and a bit more directly, Eleanor got to see how caring and ruthless Delta was. Like I said earlier, when we get the bad ending, she explains how we taught her not to let things go to waste, and that bad people should be punished for their actions, no matter how small or insignificant they were. This adds another layer to the endings overall, as these aren't just decisions that affect the ending of the game, but decisions that affect Eleanor, which then affect the ending of the game. This was mind-blowing when I had looked into the endings and how they were determined, and it's just outright incredible. While the ending of Bioshock 2 marks the end of the game, it's not really the end of the game, as Bioshock 2 came with a couple DLCs, one of which was a side story called Minerva's Den. As opposed to the main game, Minerva's Den takes a bit longer to set up the story. Instead of our main character being Subject Delta, we now play as Subject Sigma, another Alpha Series Big Daddy. As we approach a tunnel, it gets blown up and we're sent into the sea floor. We hear a man on the radio named Charles Milton Porter who instructs us to find the Thinker. We then eventually get introduced to Reed Wall. Both him and Porter were the founders of this device called the Thinker, which is great except we don't know what it is. Of course, in typical Bioshock fashion, an audio log explains it instead. The Thinker is a giant computer that uses atom to process data at the speed of thought. It's the sole reason that Rapture can even operate. It's quite a neat device, but both Reed and Porter discovered it could do so much more. This is what caused a split between the two founders. Reed wanted to use the Thinker as a prediction machine so it can bet on the ball games and see the changes in the stock market. But Porter wanted to create artificial intelligence, but more specifically, he just wanted to replicate the mind of his dead wife Pearl, who died during a German bombing. During our travels through Minerva's Den, we can also find some audio logs of Tenenbaum, which explains why she disappeared during the main story. She was trying to find a cure for Atom. Atom and the sickness that comes with repeated use is the main reason Rapture turned out this way in the first place, and if Tenenbaum can find a cure, she can not only help those who are still alive within Rapture, but also be able to take this and the plasmids to the surface with the safety of knowing that whatever happened in Rapture won't happen again. She sadly hasn't gotten very far in her research, as there is still a ton of variables that require calculation, which is why she wants the Thinker, as she believes it could solve her problem instantly. This is why she works with Porter, as they both want the Thinker to survive so they can use it for good on the surface. This is a much better introduction and now provides the reason as to why we're tasked with finding the device in the first place, as we can now change the world with the Thinker. The only problem is we don't know who we are. However, that will be explained a bit later. Sadly though, after this, there isn't much in terms of a present-day story. The main game suffers the same problem, where it's really just one objective that you need to complete, like finding Eleanor, which takes the entire game. However, Bioshock 2 splits up this objective by forcing you to interact with new people and even make some decisions. Except Minerva's Den doesn't do that. From the start to the end, the main objective is to stop Reed and find the Thinker. There are no other characters present in this DLC besides Reed, Porter, Tenenbaum, and Sigma. You don't make any choices, and there is only one ending, so it's really just a long string of tedious objectives that are broken up by more combat. I said the same thing in Bioshock 1 when talking about the Arcadia and Market levels. Taking into account the gameplay, the exploration, and the story, these levels flow really well and are fun to have combat encounters in, but when just looking at the story itself, it suffers. There just really isn't anything going on. It's like the DLC has a heavy focus of story in the beginning and the end of the playthrough, while the combat takes up the middle. Thankfully, the audio logs do break up some of the pace and allow for more story to creep in, but all this is story from the past. I'm talking about things that are happening in the here and now. Like once again how we learn about the 3 characters in the main story, then choose to spare or kill them. Or when we finally meet Eleanor, but then Sophia stops us by breaking our bond together. These are things that are happening in the present and are shaping the story. The DLC does not have any of that. The first level of the game is about going from one area to the next, grabbing items so you can open up new areas until you finally complete the whole level. This continues all the way up to the final few minutes of the game, as all we're really trying to do is just make it to the core of the central computing wing so we can find the Thinker. Throughout the whole time in this DLC, most of our interactions with these people is just Porter giving us instructions and Reed projecting a very cocky attitude because he believes that the Thinker can stop us since it can predict any outcome. Except later we discover that isn't entirely true. It is calculating what we'll do, but according to the equation, once we reach the core, it just stops. This worries him as the outcome is undetermined, something pretty much impossible to happen to the Thinker. This problem of his happens around the time we enter his office, and it's where we discover that because of this beef, Reed took it upon himself to frame Porter for a crime he didn't commit and have him thrown in jail. Since he was in jail, the Thinker would be his to control, and now he could use it for whatever he wants. But the Thinker never chose Reed, as much as he thinks this to be the case. In fact, I don't think it really chose anyone. However, it did assist Porter.
Well, Thinker, Ryan's secret police are on their way. They cooked up some kind of evidence against me. Treason, they say. I've heard what happens to folks who get disappeared, come back as one of those metal daddies. So, I'm leaving you with something to cogitate on in my absence. Inputting Rapture Departure Protocol. Figure a way to get yourself out of this city, Thinker. You've got to live on, no matter what happens to me.
So before being shipped off to prison, Porter created a program so that the Thinker could escape Reed's grasp. This makes sense, as when we enter the last few minutes of the game, Reed discovers that the Thinker wasn't working with him, but against him. It's also around this time where Reed expresses his confusion as to how Porter walked out of Persephone unscathed, and an idea came into my head, and for the very first time in this series, I finally predicted something. Because we discover that Subject Sigma is Charles Milton Porter. Going back to that Rapture Departure Protocol, the Thinker determined that the best possible way for him to escape was to enlist the help of Porter himself. To get Sigma to follow the Thinker, he used the personality duplication program, which is what Porter designed when he tried to replicate his wife, but the Thinker instead replicated Porter's own mind. Besides being a bit of an obvious twist, I was happy that I did manage to guess this, and the plot twist in general was really nice, as it does solve the question of why Sigma is even following orders to begin with. I'm just really glad that they cleared up that question by still continuing to use the Bioshock formula of a weird plot twist that ties the whole story together. After this revelation, we get to explore Porter's office and find an audio recording of his time with AI Pearl.
I believe I'm done feeding audio recordings and personal anecdotes to the Thinker. I am set to test the personality duplication function. Target personality, Pearl Porter. Thinker, are you ready?
Yes, Milton.
Starting test. Hello, Pearl.
Hello, Milton.
How have you been?
Just wonderful, Milton. I've missed you, though. It's been so long.
Pearl, No, this isn't right. It isn't her. Thinker, stop the test.
But what's the matter, Milton?
Oh, God.
Don't you still love me?
Oh, God, I said end function, Thinker. Now! It's over.
I'll admit, I've seen this exact situation tons of time in other media, and this usually ends with the person dedicated to the machine and desperately wanting their significant other back. Porter, though, immediately recognized the problems with doing something like this, so good job on Porter for breaking the mold a bit and not succumbing to your own creation. On a more serious note, this technology, while impressive, does have some adverse effects on the user, as we heard with Porter. As great as this technology is, the duplication program should not be used ever again, and I think Porter agrees. As we go further down the lower halls of the office, we can see a memorial for Pearl, meaning he still hasn't been able to move on from the incident, and honestly, who can really blame him? At the very bottom, though, is a bathysphere, and inside is Tenenbaum. With the Thinker in good hands and the two safe from harm, Tenenbaum plans to find the cure for Adam so she could change Porter back to who he once was. After that is finished, she'll then look into all the others back in Rapture. While we don't know what exactly happens, we do see parts of the suit on the ground and someone standing by a grave, which we can assume is Porter, meaning that he was able to become a human again. Overall, we get a very happy ending. The cure for Adam is complete, meaning the residents of Rapture can eventually return to being normal again. Adam and plasmids can now be used by the general public in a safe and secure manner, and Porter was able to move on and say goodbye to his wife. It's a nice conclusion to the game, and also a nice conclusion to the Rapture story. Bioshock Infinite is a pretty good game. There's a lot that it does well, but there's also a lot that it does wrong. It's got a fantastic story, with a wonderful dynamic between its two main characters, but it also has a severe lack of interesting world building and an awful DLC that was ultimately unnecessary. So without further ado, let's get started. So where else would we start then at the intro? This is the most important part of a game's story, but this is taken to the extreme with Bioshock, as these intros are made to intrigue the player enough to keep going. You may find this confusing, as I literally just described what an intro is meant to do, but think back on the previous games for a moment. Bioshock 1's story was a bit confusing, as all of a sudden we arrive at Rapture and are helping the first guy we meet, without even a chance to question why we're doing this in the first place. Bioshock 1 obviously clears this up at the end of the game in one of the best ways I've ever seen, but I can almost guarantee that the setting and combat of Bioshock 1 carried you throughout the game rather than the story of just killing the big bad guy. Well, Bioshock Infinite does the same thing. Its story is hidden and never mentioned until the very end. And because the devs know this, they need to intrigue the player enough in other ways to keep them going, like the aforementioned setting and gameplay. This is why it builds off the original game's unique introduction. Bioshock Infinite starts in 1912 with the player on a boat being taken to a lighthouse. For context, since this game is in 1912, that means we are 48 years before Bioshock 1 even occurs. That means all the previous games and their events had never happened yet. Rapture wasn't built, hell, I don't even think Ryan was born yet. We also get to see our character's face, hear their voice, and know their name, all within about 2 minutes, which is a lot faster than the previous games. Our protagonist's name is Booker DeWitt, who was brought here to do a job. Booker is then given a box with a few items, such as a pistol, a code, a picture of our target, among other items. The picture of the girl has a note on the back that says, "Bring the girl to New York unharmed," so we can assume that we're here to find this person on the card. The people taking us to the location are unknown, as they're only referred to as man and lady. However, the way they talk is odd, almost as if they're watching us from a distance. They don't talk to Booker, and if he doesn't climb the ladder, they'll say this.
He's not moving!
He will, eventually.
I suppose he does.
It's like they think they're invisible or analyzing some experiment like some scientists would do. It just feels off. As we approach the lighthouse, we get more information on the task at hand, as the note reads, "Bring us the girl and wipe away the debt." Once again, we can assume that Booker has some debts that need to be paid, and it's because of these debts that he took this job in the first place. Everything initially looks pretty normal until we see someone dead and tied up with a sign that reads, "Don't disappoint us." It continues to get even weirder, as when we finally get to the top of the lighthouse, we input the code and the sky turns red momentarily as a horn blares every time the color changes. A chair appears, and seeing as we're at the top without anywhere else to go, we take a seat.
Make yourself ready, Pilgrim. The bindings are there as a safeguard.
No, God damn it!
Ascension. Ascension in the count of 5. Count of 4.
No.
3, 2, 1. Ascension. Ascension.
Just stay calm.
5,000 feet. 10,000 feet. 15,000 feet. Hallelujah.
Words cannot describe the beauty of Colombia. It's truly a magnificent place. But after we arrive, we see a lot of religious symbolism and are told that to enter Colombia, we have to be reborn anew via baptism. We accept and are able to explore Colombia to our heart's content, but we have to remember that we're in uncharted territory and have to blend in, except that may not be as easy as it sounds, as we discover that the false shepherd is prophesied to enter Colombia with a defining mark of an AD on their hand, the same one that Booker has. We enter the city's raffle, win, and are given the reward of pelting a couple with a baseball until our identity is revealed and are forced to fight. I know I sped through that, so allow me to explain why. Bioshock Infinite on its own has a pretty fantastic intro, arguably the best in the series, but it reaches unprecedented levels of quality when you take into account Bioshock 1. Columbia and even Bioshock Infinite are the antithesis of Rapture and Bioshock 1. Not just in the setting of the two games, but the values of each setting and the actual sequence of events that occur in the game's intros. It's clear from the first moment of the game that the developers took heavy inspiration from the original. The reason being that Irrational Games, the devs behind Bioshock 1, also made Infinite, whereas 2K Games, Irrational Games' publisher, made Bioshock 2. That's not only why Bioshock 2 feels so different from the other games, but why these two feel so similar. Bioshock 1 starts on a plane that crashes in the ocean. We're then taken to a lighthouse, which then leads to Rapture. We start in the sky and end in the sea, with the lighthouse being the mediator between these two parts of the world, whereas Bioshock Infinite starts in the sea and ends in the sky, with the lighthouse being the mediator again. One game's start is the other game's end. Our first encounter with Rapture is quite dark, as the first person we see gets his guts spilled on the floor by a splicer. From the moment we enter Rapture, we are thrown into the deep end. However, as you play, you start to appreciate Rapture more, and it's almost like a home away from home, minus the splicers of course. Rapture's a really relaxing place, and the thought of what this looked like in its prime gives you that sort of warm and welcoming feeling, whereas Columbia does not. Our first interaction with Columbia is the opposite of dark. We're welcomed by many religious people before walking the streets of the city, where the citizens of Columbia will be having wonderful conversations about the city and will even greet and compliment Booker. You get that warm feeling that Rapture provides later in the game at the very start, but that warm feeling goes away eventually as you uncover Columbia's true backstory. Furthermore, each city's ideologies couldn't be farther from one another. Rapture's tagline is "No gods or kings, only man." On top of this, religion, while accepted, is not publicly shown, as Andrew Ryan didn't want any public institutions related to religion within Rapture. This is why we see the Bible amongst the cargo and smugglers' hideout. In Columbia, religion is the basis for its creation, where the people of the city worship Father Comstock, who is the leader of the Founders, a group and religion based on many traditional religious and patriotic values. We're also immediately greeted by religious quotes and Bible verses while descending into Columbia. Upon stepping out, we see a stained glass painting depicting Father Comstock bringing the people to Columbia, and there's also tons of other statues showing the city and Father Comstock's glory. I'm not a religious person, so I can't say with complete certainty, but I'm convinced that majority of these depictions of Father Comstock are literally ripped from famous artwork related to Jesus and the Bible. Because while I can't put my finger on what exactly it's referencing, these paintings feel oddly familiar to me, as if I'd seen them before in a different context. We are then shown this massive room filled with candles and water that is used for prayer and baptisms. Once we awake in Columbia, we can see the statues of the Founding Fathers, who are also revered as religious or at least prominent figures within Columbia. So we have a king in the form of Father Comstock who worships a higher being, quite different than what Andrew Ryan believed in. Ryan believed in objectivism, a belief based on the individual, and due to Rapture's location and values, it allowed those involved to succeed on an individual level. This even extends to the gameplay, as while some splicers work together, not everyone is aligned with one another. Everyone seems to be acting out of pure self-interest. In Columbia, its citizens work together for the benefit of the city and the Father. They're acting as a group rather than individuals, sort of like the family from Bioshock 2. But by far its most staggering difference is in its inclusivity. Ryan and Rapture didn't really care about the inner workings of a person as long as that person had the drive to seek something greater in their life. In Rapture, there is a prominent picture called the Rapture's Best and Brightest, and within this picture are both men and women. Those women also being Tenenbaum and Sophia Lamb, arguably the two most important women in Rapture. There's also Dr. Sue Chong, who is of Asian ethnicity, and while not in the picture, there's also Charles Milton Porter, owner of The Thinker, and he's African American. Rapture is also very accepting in regards to sexual orientation, as Sandra Cohen, one of Rapture's best and brightest, is gay. Given the time frame of the game, it's possible people will have their own opinions on someone's sex and race, but at the very least they're welcomed into Rapture and not rejected for their differences. This is in stark contrast to Columbia, where most of its regular residents are white. In fact, the first black person we see is tied to a post, because this couple is in an interracial relationship. Since Columbia is ruled by one man and not ruled by the city's basis of creation, that person's ideologies are the golden rule of the city. And Father Comstock is a white supremacist who is extremely racist against anyone who isn't white, and refuses to condemn organizations that believe in this ideology. A good example is the Order of the Ravens in Columbia, who believe in racial purity. This is reinforced by the fact that they are not only dressed as KKK members, but have paintings and statues that depict Abraham Lincoln as the devil and John Wilkes Booth, his assassin, as a hero. Within the organization, we can also see a Chinese prisoner being tortured and killed via ravens, and to top it all off, we see a statue outside of the building of Comstock defeating a multi-headed serpent. However, this serpent has the heads of 3 men, who are black, Chinese, and Jewish, all with exaggerated features like big noses and lips. As for things such as gender or sexual orientation, it's not outright said, but there is definitely some hints that Columbia's values fit with ones from the current time period. There's a severe lack of LGBT representation in this game, with the only ones I could find being the rare case a guy hits on Booker. Furthermore, women, at least those within authority or power, seem to be tolerated rather than celebrated. There's a kinetoscope of Rosalind Lutece, who is a quantum physicist and the sole reason Columbia can even float to begin with. But in this film, at the end, there's a question that says, "How does that darn thing fly?" To which she responds, "It's quantum mechanics," but at the bottom it reads, "We say it's more like women's intuition." However, there is clearly women in power like Daisy Fitzroy, so while this doesn't outright prove that all women aren't viewed the same as men, at the very least it shows how much people downplayed Lutece's creation of Columbia and her intelligence. And seeing as she's easily one of the most important women and the most intelligent person in Columbia, I can't imagine how a regular woman would be seen within the eyes of men. Besides all the symbolism and ideologies regarding Columbia, the actual interactions within the intro are extremely fun. Before taking part in the raffle, we can explore the carnival area where we can take part in carnival games involving weapons and vigors, which acts as a sort of hidden tutorial. We also see these weird interactions, most notably the statue of Rosalind Lutece changing to who we'll discover is Robert Lutece. This telegram being given to Booker that says not to pick number 77, which happens to be the ball we choose at the raffle, and then the final one where the Luteces make us play heads and tails, and not only does heads win every time, but it's won a lot. All of them are nice touches and subtle hints regarding the game's actual plot. Bioshock 1 and Infinite are the complete opposite of one another, and it's by far the best dichotomy I've seen in a game to date. Bioshock 2 built off the world of the first game, but decided to change the ideology of Rapture to show how the other end of the spectrum could operate in the same city. But Infinite took this idea and ran with it, by not only creating a city completely opposite to Rapture in just about every way, but also took specific moments and cutscenes from the first game and made those opposite when compared together. It's genius game design, genius storytelling, and overall gives Bioshock Infinite the best intro in the series. Getting back on track, we just turned a guard's brains to mush and are now fighting the Colombian police while trying to find the girl we came here for. Within this section is the aforementioned Order of Ravens, but there also seems to be a secret home a little farther down for people who actually praise Abraham Lincoln. There isn't much here, but it is nice to see that some of the residents don't all share the same values. After multiple battles with the city's police, we're briefly stopped by Comstock himself, who claims to not only know who Booker is, but all of his past sins, including Wounded Knee, the Pinkertons, his gambling and alcohol addiction, and someone named Anna. This made the situation a bit more tense, as now we aren't operating away from the watchful eye of Comstock, as he not only knows who Booker is, but why he is here. It makes the player question who this Comstock really is and how he's related to Booker. Furthermore, it also forces the player to question what Booker did. We then make it to Monument Island, the place where this girl should be located, and it's clear here that the game is trying to set up the typical girl trapped in the tower trope. But the way this was presented in the game is really well done, as once again these chilling feelings of the story continue to grow. All throughout the area are caution signs and a plethora of equipment and wires that make it feel like a laboratory rather than a home. It's a lot different than what one would expect, as you would think this girl is either relaxing in some random house or at a very top of a luxurious tower. And while the latter is technically true, large rich towers don't usually come equipped with caution signs and chalkboards full of data. It continues to get even weirder as we see photography rooms filled with pictures of her and rooms that seem to be made for testing and experiment, most likely involving her. There's even a projector that has some film of this girl doing specific tasks like dancing, painting, and lockpicking. We then get to see how the operation was created, as there is two-way mirrors in these rooms, allowing them to spy on her without her knowing. We also get to see her open a portal to another world before closing it momentarily. It's given just the right amount of time to confuse the player on what the hell just happened without it being overly long, and also calls back to the rest of the tower. Now it makes sense why they were testing and observing her. She clearly has these superpowers. Booker tries to find his way around the rooms, but falls through the ceiling, which rightfully startles her. This girl is Elizabeth, and she is one of the most intricate characters in the entire series. She is shocked by Booker's arrival in the tower and attacks him until she realizes this is the moment she's been waiting for. She can now finally escape this tower that she has been stuck in since she was a child. So Elizabeth and Booker escape the tower together until Elizabeth's mechanical bodyguard Songbird shows up and attempts to stop Booker. The bird almost succeeds, but Booker, despite falling an incredibly far distance, is able to live thanks to falling into one of Columbia's beaches. So what's really going on here? Well, Elizabeth has the unique ability to open tears. These tears are essentially ripples in time that allow the person viewing the tear to see into an alternate dimension. This is why we can hear the song Fortunate Son through one of the tears later in the game, despite that song not being created for another 40 years. These tears aren't unique to the individual, as we see more kinetoscopes of people talking about the tears. So everyone can view them, but not everyone can create them. The two most notable characters that can create these tears is Elizabeth and Lutece. Rosalind, before Columbia, was experimenting with atoms and found a way to indefinitely suspend atoms in midair. This led to the aptly named Lutece field discovery. Comstock would eventually meet with Lutece through some way, and through their collaboration would create Columbia using her Lutece field. As thanks for helping create the floating city, Comstock promised that she could continue her experimentation, and it was during these experiments that she met Robert. Despite what the game will initially tell you, Robert is not the twin of Rosalind. He is Rosalind. In an alternate world, Rosalind was born a man named Robert. These two are the same person, just in different timelines. As for Elizabeth, she was able to create tears from a very early age. It's not explained why just yet, but it will be towards the end of the game. Whereas Lutece is able to create one through science and experimentation, Elizabeth can just create one when she wants. She also mentions that when she was younger, she was able to create new worlds with these tears, but now she isn't able to as often. This is most likely due to the siphon equipment in the tower, as it's literally siphoning her powers away. I don't think it's necessarily removing it altogether, but more like storing it, as when we get to the end of the game, she is way more powerful, implying that we were able to give them back to her. Speaking of Elizabeth, after we regain our footing on the beach, we go to find her and try to get her out of the city, but it seems that Comstock and his forces have already caught on to our location. This is also Elizabeth's first time experiencing combat, and I really like how they didn't just have her deal with it, as right at the moment the shooting starts, she runs away and we have to chase her down. The reason she ran is because Elizabeth thinks Booker is a killer, and given how many people we just killed, she's not entirely wrong. I like that Irrational Games took into consideration how Elizabeth would feel after seeing someone die, as it's not something you can simply brush off. This also extends to the numerous other things Elizabeth does, like cover her ears during this scene when the noise gets too loud, or just interacting with the environment like when she asks for cotton candy. It's incredibly small, but it heightens the experience of the game. I find myself always looking at Elizabeth, waiting to see where she'll go next or what she'll say, since her input was always interesting to hear. This also extends to her relationship with Booker. Bioshock 2 had this father-daughter style dynamic as well with Delta and Eleanor, but what I really think makes Infinite better in this regard is because we actually get to spend time with Elizabeth. Obviously the reason why we can't see Eleanor is due to the plot, but still. Elizabeth acts like this little girl who is seeing the world for the first time, and Booker becomes this father figure making sure she doesn't run off and get into danger, and I really love the dynamic they have. After some time, Booker and Elizabeth will come across Lady Comstock's airship as they plan to use that as their means of escape, but it's blocked and can only be accessed by using the Shock Jockey Vigor. This then leads to duo to Cornelius Slate, who has a really interesting section as it forces Booker to confront his past. Slate and Booker knew each other before the events of the game, as they were at Wounded Knee together. After this, Booker would reflect on his life and his actions, while Slate would meet and join Father Comstock, who would then lead them to the Boxer Rebellion. Both of these events were gruesome and tragic times for Booker, so having him relive his past while also having Elizabeth discover his past was an intense moment. We the player figured this out alongside Elizabeth, and after this encounter you start to view Booker as a completely different person, for better or for worse. Both Wounded Knee and the Boxer Rebellion were also real-world events that happened, which made learning about these all the more interesting. Wounded Knee was an awful massacre that saw an army of United States soldiers kill over 300 Native Americans. During this massacre, Booker was accused by a sergeant that he had Native American blood in him. To avoid the backlash and repercussions that would come from this, Booker decided to prove to his fellow men that he was indeed a true soldier of America by scalping many Native Americans and then burning dozens of teepees. Wounded Knee is not only an incredible part of the story as it defines Booker's character, but it's more important for us the player as we get to see who Booker really is, and are given the option to form our own opinion about him that will continue to stay throughout the whole game. For the Bioshock series, this was a nice twist, as we went from having two Samaritans who got caught up in terrible circumstances to a protagonist who is a mass murderer. It's a unique idea for the series and one that I welcomed. As for the other tragic event in history, the Boxer Rebellion was a war that started because a group of Chinese anti-Christians called the Boxers were killing and massacring Christian missionaries, churches, and parishioners throughout all of northern China. In real life, this led to the creation of the Eight-Nation Alliance, which included countries like the British Empire, the United States, Russia, Japan, and many others, all of whom were against the Boxers. As for Bioshock Infinite, it's unclear whether Columbia fought them alone or joined the Eight-Nation Alliance, but given why this rebellion started, it's obvious Columbia wanted some revenge, even if it didn't directly involve them. These events were a part of Comstock's history, which means it was also part of Columbia's history, which is why there's an exhibit of the events in the Hall of Heroes. However, Slate doesn't like the exhibit, as it claims that Comstock was not only at the Battle of Wounded Knee, but was the hero of the Boxer Rebellion. He's technically wrong, but he's technically right, but we'll get to that later. After the exhibit, we can make it to the main attraction, which is another exhibit related to Lady Comstock. Here's where we also get to learn about the Vox Populi. Since entering Columbia, we have heard a few rumors about them, and this is no different. According to the exhibit, we learn that not only is Elizabeth the daughter of Comstock, but Lady Comstock was also murdered by her servant Daisy Fitzroy, who would eventually become the leader of the Vox Populi, a rebellious organization looking to put an end to the current rule of Columbia and take it for their own. Many of its members are Irish and African American, two groups of people who are notably discriminated against within Columbia. Once again, this is another great moment for the story, as we not only got some key information, but Elizabeth is now learning her own backstory alongside us, and the revelation that the man who had locked her up in the tower was her father is a terrifying feeling for her.
The seed of the prophet shall sit the throne and drown in flame the mountains of man.
Am I?
You're Comstock's daughter.
No, I can't be. I can't.
He wants you to follow in his footsteps.
Well, I want a puppy, but that doesn't mean I'm gonna get one.
The beginning of that speech is also pretty important, as Comstock says, "The seat of the prophet shall sit the throne and drown in flame the mountains of man." Remember this for later. Once all the exhibits are done, we can confront Slate so we can get our shock jockey, and it's here where it's probably a good time to mention this game's combat. Infinite's combat bothers me quite a lot. Bioshock 1 and 2 had the uniqueness of the splicers, who not only had some decent personality via combat dialogue, but also looked unique and were just overall a blast to fight against. I don't feel the same way when I play Infinite. Maybe it's because I like the older game's health system, or that those games had different ammo types with actual unique weapons, or the beauty of the plasmids, but something always feels off every time I play. One other issue is that theme of morality. There is none of that in this game, and for a series that has stuck with it for 2 straight games, it's a shame to see it disappear in this title. This may have something to do with how the narrative is structured and how we're given the illusion of choice, but Bioshock 1 and 2 did the same thing and managed to give us multiple endings to this story, and also feel like our choices had some amount of weight to it. This also extends to the larger enemies in the game, whereas in Bioshock 1, deciding to fight the big daddies was an impossible feat. You were supposed to view this as a difficult battle, but assuming you were skilled enough to prevail, you were given an immense amount of gear and Atom to use. Infinite doesn't have this, as there's no decisions that hold any weight. You just simply go from objective to objective, fighting people along the way without a care in the world. And while the game isn't that long, it does get quite boring when you just want to learn the story but are stuck fighting a bunch of enemies because Elizabeth can't pick the lock needed to progress. Even the original games fell into this trap sometimes, but they still managed to add something to the combat, like Sandra Cohen's art exhibit, which is really just a ton of combat back to back. But with the added distinctiveness of the enemies themselves, and the fact that we had to take pictures of their corpses so that we can display them, it added a bit of variety. It wasn't much variety, but it at least made the combat a bit more engaging. The combat in Infinite is very actiony and streamlined. You aren't really fighting for resources or upgrades, as Elizabeth more often than not will keep you stocked when needed. There's no health kits the player can have in stock, and the shield also regenerates. Given these additions and literally just how the combat arenas work in this game, it's clear that Irrational Games went for a more action-adventure title rather than one that had immersive sim or survival elements. It's practically a railroaded shooter without any variety. This lack of variety also extends to the levels themselves. If I'm being honest, Infinite may have some of the worst levels in the series. Columbia itself is gorgeous, just like Rapture, but throughout the game we were able to see different areas, all with different backstories. I can name quite a few of the levels in the past games, but I can barely remember the names of a couple locations in Columbia, and the only ones I do remember were only because of one scene in the level that either I hated or I loved, other than the actual beauty, creativity, and the lore that the level brings into the world. Bioshock 1 had levels like Hephaestus, Medical Pavilion, Fort Frolic, Arcadia, and so many more that served some purpose. Fort Frolic was the entertainment center run by Sandra Cohen, and Arcadia was a botanical garden that also helped supply Rapture's oxygen. Infinite's levels don't take from what Bioshock 1 started. There is rarely any levels that actually attempt to show that Columbia is more than just a few areas made by some developers. There's no levels that showcase how the quantum particles can suspend the city in the air, how the people of the city can even breathe this high up, considering at the very least oxygen would not be plentiful at 15,000 feet, or even where the energy comes from to even power this city. Emporia, a late game area which is known to be a place in Columbia for the ultra rich, looks no different than the welcoming center in the beginning of the game. Thankfully it's not all bad, as Shantytown is a really good level that does highlight a lot of differences between the others, but that's only a couple levels out of the total of 16. All of these problems make it quite difficult to play again, and yes, this is more of a critique of the gameplay rather than the story, which is the opposite of the intended purpose for this video, but we have discussed in the previous games how its gameplay was intertwined with the narrative, thanks to the themes of morality with the Little Sisters, and how we're in this unknown location, so by making the game more survival focused, it tied the game's combat to its story. Infinite just feels like a playground adventure where we go on zip lines and mow down dozens of enemies without at all considering that we're literally in the same situation as Delta and Jack. We are lost in an unknown city and have to struggle to survive, but Infinite fails to convey this. Earlier we talked about the Vox Populi, and it's after the fight with Slade where we get to learn more about them. Elizabeth during our journey says how she wants to escape and go to Paris, but as we remember, Booker has a job to do and that means we go to New York. So when he takes control of the First Lady's airship, he sets the destination to New York. Elizabeth catches onto this and gets a bit emotional. Honestly, I was going to mention how awful her crying is, but it does make sense as she is faking it so that Booker drops his guard so she can knock him out. Elizabeth disappears right after this as she was about to depart, but the Vox Populi show up. Booker then meets with Daisy and they come to an agreement. If Booker gets Daisy the guns needed for the army, then she'll give him the airship back. Where they drop us off though is Finkton, a place owned by Jeremiah Fink, the one we saw in the intro. Even though this is the first time we are without Elizabeth, it doesn't last that long as we'll eventually catch up to her, and while we do repair the relationship, it's not back to what it was before, as Elizabeth is a bit more cynical, and only joins him because he's the only way she'll get to Paris. She sees Booker as a means to an end, similar to how Booker viewed Elizabeth in the beginning. We're only halfway through the game, and already their relationship has taken so many different turns, and it's only going to continue as we progress, and I must say it's really well done. As I said, we're now in Finkton, and this is one of those locations where I only remember it because of one scene.
10! 10, now 10! 9 and 50! 9 and 50, any lower now? 9 and 10! 9 and 10! 9, 9, 9! 8 and 33! I hear 8 and 33! 8 and 33! 8 and 33! We got our fitter in the green shirt!
Cannot become a lion, and why would you want to?
I need this job!
Responsibilities and worry. You do your job.
I don't really have much to add here. I think the scene speaks for itself. People are so desperate enough for jobs that they're willing to fight others to get it. What they're auctioning here, by the way, is their time, saying that they can get the job done faster than anyone else. The first auction that occurred was for someone to haul a half a ton of coal from Fink Manufacturing to Shantytown, and the guy who won believed he could do it in 5 minutes and 50 seconds. It's unclear what happens, but I can only assume if they fail, they probably don't get paid for the job or unable to work other jobs due to the lack of work ethic in the eyes of the company. Besides being the location of some of the worst conditions in Columbia, it's also here where the story goes off the rails. I briefly talked about the tears and how they are portals to other dimensions, and all of that is shown here. We make it to the gunsmith location and discover that he's gone. However, his wife is still here and says that they took him and locked him up. We end up finding where he's located and also find out that he was being tortured for information. But when we arrive in his cell, we discover that he's dead. The Lutesses show up again and in a cryptic way explain that while we see Mr. Lin as dead, he can also be seen as alive. It's just a matter of perspective. That's when a tear appears and shows that Mr. Lin was never killed in another universe, meaning we can still get the guns to Daisy. Of course, in this version of Columbia, Mr. Lin is alive, but that's not the only thing that's changed. The police we killed earlier are now alive again, but something's wrong. They're alive, but they're dead. They are alive, but they remember being dead, so they're going insane. This sort of situation happens a few times with Booker, where he starts bleeding out of nowhere. The reason he's bleeding is because his mind is taking his current memories and combining it with new memories, and it's causing this nauseous effect in his mind and causing him to bleed. They are alive in this world, but they remember their other selves in a previous timeline dying thanks to these new memories suddenly appearing in their minds when Booker enters this new Columbia. Adding on to more changes, we see that Mr. Lin is alive, but is going a bit insane, but more importantly, his wife is white now and now a devout follower of Father Comstock as opposed to the original version who was Asian and praying to Buddha. We learn from his wife that the weapons he made are in Shantytown, which is our next stop. Shantytown is a pretty good level as we get to see how the lower class of Columbia live. There are signs everywhere asking people for food or for a doctor, and the bar down the street even has a corpse in it, and judging from the knife and the blood on the table, I think we know why. As usual, we're going to need to push through lots of guards to make it to our objective, but once we arrive, we hit another roadblock. While in this Columbia, Mr. Lin is alive, the tools are chained up and extremely heavy. However, there's another tear showing that these tools aren't there, meaning they're already back at the shop. So we go through another tear into another Columbia, but once again, this isn't the only thing that has changed.
Bring us the girl and wipe away the debt. As plans go, I'd seen worse, except this girl was already gone. Monument Island's a damn ghost town. It seems like they evacuated her when they heard I was here. An old friend told me Comstock spirited her off to that fortress of his. As a one-man job, this just went from betting on the river to drawing dead.
So it seems that Elizabeth has been taken from Monument Island, and since Booker couldn't find her, it seems like he joined the Vox as a way to take down Comstock. However, judging from the posters, it seems like he died and has now become a martyr for the Vox. I also realized that we're 30 minutes into this video, and I haven't even mentioned the voxophones yet. Bioshock Infinite, like its predecessors, has audio logs in the form of voxophones, but unlike the other games, I think Infinite really lacks in this department as well. Some of the audio logs are quite nice as they do provide a decent amount of story, like some of the ones from Booker's past or most of Daisy Fitzroy's, but many of them just seem to exist without real substance. I think 60% of them is just speeches from Lady Comstock and Father Comstock about some stuff that really doesn't matter. There is a nice set of logs from a Hattie Gerst, very reminiscent of Mark Meltzer, that talks about her husband and how he came down with an illness, but since there wasn't much that could be done, he decided to become one of the handymen in hopes of having a chance at life, but ultimately would eventually perish at the hands of the Vox when he went to work for the Founders. As I said, there's some pretty decent story within these logs, I just feel like the previous games did it a whole lot better. Getting back on track, we're still in Shantytown in this new Columbia, but Booker starts bleeding again since the memories of his current self and his other self from this universe are blending together. In this Columbia, the Vox not only have a foothold in Shantytown, but also in Finkton, as there are Vox forces everywhere. But every action has its consequences. In this world, while the weapons and tools were brought to the Vox, Mr. Lin and his wife are dead. Elizabeth is upset at this revelation, as while there probably wasn't much they could have done to prevent this outcome, it's still something she hadn't considered, that across multiple timelines and universes, people can be dead and alive at any time. On a more positive note though, we did get Daisy her gun so we can get the airship back. At least that's what Booker believes, because that deal was made with the first Columbia's Daisy Fitzroy. There's no way to be sure that this Daisy made the same deal. I'm not sure if this is to showcase how confused Booker has gotten after jumping through two different worlds, or a lack of polish when it comes to this game's writing. After joining the Vox and pushing back the founders, Daisy calls us and our cover's been blown. Daisy believes that we're an imposter of the real Booker DeWitt, so she has the Vox attack us. Once we battle through some of the Vox, we meet Daisy and just at the perfect time to see her kill Fink. And while cool, I gotta ask, what was with this blood wiping thing? I'm not even going to talk about the risk of infection that could happen from this, but what was the point? Was it to show that she's somehow crazy, or that she's badass, that she'll kill someone and wipe their blood on her face? I don't know, it just felt really unnecessary. Once again, after more fighting, we can finally confront her, but she has a child held hostage, and the only way to stop her is to have Elizabeth sneak in and kill her. Just like the many interactions we've seen before, this makes total sense. Anyone would be in a state of disarray after taking someone's life, especially someone like her who's a very caring person. This decision, however, changes Elizabeth. She becomes a woman now instead of just a girl. This is symbolized in her cutting her hair and also changing her outfit and demeanor. You may be confused as to how this is supposed to make her a woman, but the DLC will explain this. But we have the airship and can now escape to Columbia, except nothing's ever easy. This highlights a glaring issue with this game, and that's the constant backtracking and cliffhanging when it comes to completing objectives. The other two games did this as well, but they weren't as bad as Infinite. To give you a refresher, we got the objective to reach the First Lady's airship when we landed on the beach, but we were then blocked by the rail system and needed some shock jockey, so we started backtracking. After getting the shock jockey, Elizabeth knocks us out since Booker was going to take her to New York instead. So now we have to join Daisy and get the Vox their guns for their war. Once again, more backtracking. That's also not even getting into the multiple times we have to go through Finkton because Mr. Lin is dead in one world and alive in another, but the tools aren't here but they're in another, so we go back and forth between the same area at least 3 different times. And then finally, after all these objectives are completed, totaling about 4 hours of playtime, Songbird comes back and wrecks the airship. I can't decide whether or not I'd actually be more upset if we just simply lost the airship again and had to find it a third time rather than seeing 4 hours of work get destroyed in a matter of seconds, but either option would definitely not be preferable. You literally spend a third of this game, probably more than that, doing this one objective, but the game attempts to disguise it by giving you small tasks along the way. I would argue this is just as bad as rescuing Atlas's family, which took just as long, all for that to fail as well. But not only was this faked and shows the depths that Fontaine was willing to go to succeed, but there was actual emotion behind this scene. It goes from an action-packed race as we try to save the family before they're killed by splicers to immediately shifting into a somber, more emotional track of music with this calming aftermath. We were too late, and Atlas couldn't save his family, and he pours his heart out during this scene, and it emotionally resonates with the player, as not only does Atlas want to kill Ryan, we do as well. Booker and Elizabeth just move right along, completely ignoring the fact that the one thing they've spent hours trying to find is gone. No emotion, no break in the action, just another scene with the Lutesses. It's utterly surreal how I was the only one who was emotionally torn because of this, yet none of the characters seem to agree. This probably wouldn't be half as bad if this tragedy wasn't followed up by probably one of the worst levels in the entire game. Emporia is awful, and literally because of one enemy, Lady Comstock. Admittedly, from a story perspective, it's pretty good, as we learn that Father Comstock was sterile due to the multiple tests he had done with the tears, meaning Elizabeth isn't related to Father Comstock, and then we also discover that Lady Comstock never actually liked Elizabeth and saw her as an illegitimate child, to which she would eventually attempt to blackmail Father Comstock by claiming to tell all of Columbia that Elizabeth isn't his daughter. He would then take it upon himself to kill her for saying this, but her servant Daisy had walked in during the killing, forcing Comstock to pin the blame on her, which of course explains how Daisy became the leader of the Vox. On top of this, we also learned that the Lutesses were killed by Fink, who was ordered by Father Comstock to carry out the hit. It is some genuinely incredible backstory, and it's story I've been waiting to hear. It's just a shame it's surrounded by this level. I can't be 100% certain on this claim, but I do hope that many can agree that Lady Comstock's boss fight is just bad, both narratively and mechanically. The series has always struggled with boss fights, and this is no exception. The whole reason we even fight her is because Elizabeth and Booker are once again hit with another roadblock, which is a door that will only open for Lady Comstock. And even though she has been dead for some time, she's been locked in an airtight coffin to preserve her body. But when we open it, she becomes a ghost and raises the dead to fight us. This is truly where the game went off the rails. It felt so far-fetched to me that I was genuinely confused on how this was even possible. The real reason the ghost is even an entity to begin with is because it's a combination of both Elizabeth's feeling towards her and Lady Comstock's body. That's why she acts angrily towards us, just as Elizabeth felt angry at Lady Comstock for not being her mother. The two end up forgiving each other, though, for the pain they cause one another, which ultimately allows us to get into Comstock's house, and Lady Comstock herself gets to rest in peace. I understand Bioshock is a series where we have magic and cities that are located in uninhabitable environments, but I don't recall the series ever going this far with its science fiction elements. The only other time we saw ghosts in this game was back in Rapture, but these were cleared up by the story in a fairly believable way, which was due to Adam not only altering people's genetic code, but by also constantly being recycled thanks to the Little Sisters. It caused certain memories of other people to be shown in the form of ghostly apparitions. Was it a bit much? Maybe a little, but there was at least a valiant attempt to try to explain the phenomenon and also ground it into the world. This game's version of Ghosts is just the complete opposite. She's also an absolute bullet sponge, and while I didn't mind it the first time, my mood got progressively worse after the second and third time we fight her the same exact way. After finally being led inside, we're stopped once again by a resident roadblock, but this time Songbird actually succeeds and manages to take Elizabeth away from us. Booker manages to just barely survive, but as he attempts to chase her down, he stops momentarily as he notices that snow is on the ground despite it being July. Booker has been pulled into yet another version of Columbia. These screams of Elizabeth that we hear in-game are not actually happening in the current Columbia, as he discovers that they're from a tear. This tear is the previous Columbia we were just in, implying he's now somewhere else. This Columbia is what would happen if Comstock fulfilled his prophecy. I told you earlier to remember that quote, "The drown in flames the mountain of man." This is why. This world of Columbia is one where Comstock passes away and Elizabeth has become his successor. At the end of his prophecy is Columbia fighting against the United States. We see a much older Elizabeth as well in this world, and it's discovered that she brought us here into this world to show us what could happen if Comstock wins. She then gives us a note for Elizabeth, but doesn't tell us what it means, as it's for her eyes only. Old Lady Elizabeth then sends us back into Columbia, and we're just in time as we can see that they are in the process of extracting Elizabeth's power. Knowing what can happen if they succeed, we put a stop to it and rescue Elizabeth. We're now just a few steps away from reaching Comstock. All we have to do is just get aboard his ship. And if you weren't convinced that Infinite was a playground adventure game with cool explosions and high-octane combat, then this surely should have convinced you. Booker, as a one-man army, charges towards the airship, killing dozens of soldiers along the way. He also has to defend the airship by himself, with the occasional help of Songbird. As an ending battle, it's heroic, tough, and really cool. As an ending for Bioshock, it's absurd. I've already explained in detail my issues about this game's new combat style, as it doesn't fit with the themes of Bioshock, and this fight was a big reason why. Seeing as we finally made it to the ending, we can now understand the story, except we aren't there just yet. Bioshock Infinite really likes to hold the plot twist until the very last minute. In the airship is the Prophet himself. Comstock doesn't tell us anything and instead wants DeWitt to tell Elizabeth the real truth, even though he has no idea what's going on. Due to his ignorance, he takes this opportunity to drown Comstock and put an end to his reign. Honestly, I've been waiting for Booker to be completely honest about his feelings towards Elizabeth, and I'm so glad he was finally able to do that. It's clear that he cares about her. He may not have been before when he first met her, but over time this became more than just a job for him, further solidifying that the way their relationship was written over the course of the game was stellar and by far one of the best parts of this game. Fast forwarding a bit, we defend the airship and are able to use Songbird to destroy the tower which houses the siphons that took Elizabeth's powers. Once those were destroyed, she regains all of them back. Immediately after this, we take Songbird down to Rapture, which kills him due to the water pressure. We then take a bathysphere to a weird world with dozens of lighthouses. These doors are like physical doors to other worlds, and with all her powers back, she can see into all of them. Regardless if that door is in the past, present, or future, she can not only see the doors, but also what's inside of them. She's practically all-knowing at this point, which explains why the ending of the game happens the way that it does. At the very end, Booker is taken back to the baptism he had before the events of the game, but he refuses just like before. However, Booker is told by Elizabeth that he didn't refuse in some worlds and that altered things in that world. It's also revealed that because of this event, Booker is also Father Comstock. After the events of Wounded Knee, Booker was regretful of his actions and saw clarity through religion, but that was in his world. In some worlds he also refused, but in others he agreed to the baptism. Those who agreed would become Father Comstock. If Booker refused, he stays the depressed and regretful Booker DeWitt, but if he agreed, he's reborn a new man, one who is cleared of all sins and is reborn again in the face of God. This leads him down a new holier path, and a new man needs a new name, so he would then change it to Zachary Hale Comstock. That is the true plot twist of Bioshock Infinite. Booker has been fighting himself the whole game, but we're still not done yet. Once again, this game is about constants and variables. Everything in Booker's life was a constant up until the baptism. Every single version of Booker, whether they stayed Booker or became Comstock, all took a part in Wounded Knee. That's why Slate was mad at Comstock for claiming to be at Wounded Knee when he knew he wasn't there. He was, but not as Comstock, as this was before the baptism. Once Booker goes to the baptism, the world splits. If Booker rejects, he then stays the Booker DeWitt. During this time, Booker would then join the Pinkerton Detective Agency, where he would garner a reputation for ending worker strikes with severe violence. It was also here where he would meet Annabelle, the woman who would eventually become his wife. They would then end up having a child, Anna. Yes, I know how confusing that sounds, but this birth would end up causing more problems for Booker. Not only did Annabelle die during the pregnancy, but due to her death, he acquired a massive gambling and drinking problem, leaving him in massive debt. However, Robert Lutece arrived at his office one day and offered to take Anna from him, which would absolve his debt. That phrase, "bring us the girl and wipe away the debt," was not about rescuing Elizabeth, it was about selling Anna to Robert so that he could be debt-free. Right after this happened though, Booker regretted his actions and chased Robert down an alley where he also meets Comstock and Rosalind. Just as he's about to pull her through, her pinky is caught and taken off. Anna is gone. And it's due to this decision that Booker decided to get the AD on his hand for his daughter, Anna DeWitt. But while he may know her as Anna, we know her by a different name, because we know someone else whose pinky is gone, Elizabeth. She is Booker's daughter. Let me dial things back a bit and talk about Comstock, because then this will tie things together. Should Booker accept the baptism, he would then become Comstock. He would then eventually meet Rosalind and create Columbia. During this time as leader and as prophet, he gained a very large following of devotees, one of whom was called Annabelle, the alternate version of Annabelle DeWitt, but now Annabelle Comstock, or as we know her, Lady Comstock. But we know the pair couldn't have a kid due to Comstock being sterile thanks to those tear tests. So he sought out an heir, and the three of them, Comstock, Rosalind, and Robert, determined that an heir from another world could work. This is what caused Robert to meet with Booker, take Anna, then jump back into their world. The only question is, what is with the Luteces trying to help us and encourage Booker to find Elizabeth? Well, the pair ended up discovering what we did, that the destruction of New York would happen if things went to plan. So they attempted to fix their mistake, but as we talked about earlier, they were killed before they could try. However, for some reason, they were able to move across space and time whenever and wherever they wanted, allowing them both to exist and not exist. Remember, it's all a matter of perspective. Seeing as they were still technically alive, they continued with their plan and found Booker. They then took Booker from his world into one where Comstock was, in hopes of redoing their mistake, but it didn't work. If the coin flip is to be taken literally, then this isn't the first time they've tried to get Booker to kill Comstock. And if I'm not mistaken, then we are the 123rd attempt at this experiment. This would explain why Rosalind in the intro was very annoyed at the experiment since they keep failing. Elizabeth had learned all of this, and both Booker and her agreed that the only way to prevent Comstock from ever doing all of this was to smother him in his crib when he was a baby. Booker meant this literally. Elizabeth meant this metaphorically. Technically, Comstock's first day on Earth was after the baptism, so by killing Booker before the baptism takes place, she would end up killing Comstock before he was even born. The only reason this works is because the baptism is the constant. The outcome is the variable. But by killing him before the baptism, we change the constant and thus change the entire timeline. Since Booker was never given a choice at the baptism, the variables couldn't exist, thus removing all the Comstocks and Columbias from the timeline. It's a bit confusing, but I've always understood this ending as all the Bookers that would accept the baptism, meaning they would become Comstock, would all die, and those who don't accept the baptism don't die since they never become Comstock. You may notice during the scene that none of them are wearing the necklace we gave her, meaning that our Elizabeth is still alive. Basically, our Elizabeth, the one we've been with since the beginning of the game, is kind of like the Luteces. Whereas the Luteces received their trans-dimensional powers after death, Elizabeth seemed to just have them because she can open and create tears. After this bombshell of information, we get an after credits cutscene that shows Booker waking up to Anna crying. It's unclear how to interpret this, but some have claimed that this is simply just another Booker before he sold Anna, or that because the timelines got reset, so to speak, that everything is back to normal. But then there's been even more discussion about whether or not Anna is even truly in the crib because we never see her. Personally, I think they just added this because they wanted the game to have a mysterious cliffhanger, as it's really hard to care about when there isn't any substance to go off of, but it's not a huge problem since the answer doesn't matter anyway. This, though, is the full and transparent story of Bioshock Infinite. What an absolute wild story this has become. So firstly, I didn't mind the homage they paid to Rapture, although it does feel a bit like nostalgia bait more than anything to remind us that we're still playing a Bioshock game. It was cool, but it felt a little forced. However, the ending overall was fantastic. Admittedly, it's very confusing and definitely something I didn't understand, but as time went on, things started to click more and more. There is a growing debate, though, amongst the community about this ending. It's probably the only Bioshock game that is as heavily split. Some saying that this is the best in the series and claiming that if you don't like it, it's because you don't understand it, but some argue back and say that they do understand it and still dislike it, or that this complexity is reason enough for them to dislike it. As for me, though, I think this ending is really good. Would I have preferred Infinite not go as far as it did with its sci-fi elements? Absolutely. I think the introduction of tears, multiple universes, and quantum mechanics was a bit unnecessary, as this made the story a bit of a chore to sift through so I could finally understand the meaning behind everything. But despite that, Infinite's story wraps up quite nicely, and as a whole, it's pretty great. Once again, Infinite manages to completely fool the player despite the expected plot twist, and the relationship between Booker and Elizabeth was easily the best part of the game. It also seemed to do exactly what it set out to do, provide the fans a Bioshock game that doesn't have many callbacks to the other games, allowing it to live on its own. That's what I would have said if they didn't release the DLC. Bioshock Infinite would eventually add a 2-part episodic DLC called Burial at Sea, and when I heard that the DLC was heading back to our favorite underwater city, I was all ears. Burial at Sea starts with Elizabeth entering a detective's office. This detective is Booker DeWitt. It's a different Booker, but the same Elizabeth. We can piece this together from multiple conversations between the two. The reason Elizabeth shows up here is because she's hiring this Booker to find a missing girl named Sally. Considering how strong Elizabeth is thanks to her powers and how much knowledge she has from those powers, we can assume that there's an underlying meaning to all of this. After accepting the job, Booker leaves the office and we're finally able to see Rapture in its prime, and it's magnificent. I spent a good hour in this area just taking everything in. Even if it was something that was pretty much insignificant, it was still great to explore. We also get to see the little sisters up close, and this brings up something we should mention. The time and date for this DLC is December 31st, 1958, the same day that Rapture would be under siege by Fontaine and his Splicer army. This obviously caused a lot of tension within me while playing, as I knew at some point things were about to go off. Furthermore, that means that the little sisters at this point were only bonded with one Big Daddy, because this is the same date that Delta and Eleanor were patrolling the hallways of Rapture. So Elizabeth takes us to Sandra Cohen, as she believes that Cohen knows where Sally went. Once again, I really like seeing Sandra Cohen again, and it also further confirms that he was always a crazed lunatic even before the riots on New Year's Eve. To get any information out of him, we need to dance for him, just like his previous subjects. However, just like that previous couple, we upset him and Fitzpatrick shocks us. By the way, if that name rings a bell, here's a quick refresher.
Oh God, you sick fuck, let me out of there!
Afterwards, Booker and Elizabeth wake up in a bathysphere that is headed towards the Fontaine department store. However, we only get to explore the warehouse section of it. This department store was sunk by Andrew Ryan during his feuds with Fontaine. He would eventually lock up any other insane splicers down here so that Rapture could run smoothly. This seems to operate like Persephone, which was also a prison in Rapture, so I guess this means Persephone was for regular inmates and people Ryan believed were going to ruin his city, while the department store seemed to only be related to Fontaine and his army. It's a little weird, but I'll go with it. After tons of combat and exploration, we get some backstory on Sally and discover that after Fontaine and the orphanage went down, lots of the little girls were roaming the city. Sally came by and Booker, being nice, opted to give her a place to settle down, but he assumed it would only be temporary. She enjoyed being around Booker quite a lot and ended up staying permanently. However, this Booker, like the others, was also a gambler and an alcoholic. One day he was gambling and without noticing, Sally was taken. Booker was then told shortly after that she was confirmed dead, but as we'll discover soon, that was a lie. Booker and Elizabeth come across Sally, meaning she's still in fact alive, but she's also inside one of the little sister vents and won't come out. Elizabeth has the insane idea to heat up the vents and lock all the entrances so that she only has one way to come out. After doing this, Booker runs to the vent to discover that she has become a little sister. Clearly, she is scared and agitated, so that alerts her Big Daddy and we're forced to fight it. Also, I think this is a plot hole. This should be an Alpha Series Big Daddy, not the bouncer type we see here. The bouncer and Rosie Big Daddies of Bioshock 1 existed at this point in time, but were only used for maintenance and underwater excavation. The Alpha Series were the only ones with a bond, and that bond was with one little sister. After After killing the Big Daddy though, we uncover the full truth of episode 1. This Booker is actually a Comstock. This Comstock, however, is unique to all the others, as instead of successfully taking Anna from Booker, he failed. Not only did Booker have more control of Anna, but their struggle left Anna's head on Comstock's side, decapitating her. Overcome with guilt, Comstock asked the Lutesses to send him to a place so that he may forget all he has done. This is what caused him to go to Rapture and readopt his Booker name. Comstock is rightfully shocked by this discovery and tries to apologize, but Elizabeth isn't here for apologies and has him killed by a Big Daddy. Episode 1, minus the slight mix-up with the Big Daddies, was great and once again makes sense. Elizabeth at the end of the game wanted revenge for what Comstock did to her. We can see that when Booker attempts to stop her. Booker of course clarifies that he wants to kill him for her, but this leaves a hole within her. She won't be allowed to take her anger out on the man who not only imprisoned her, but all the other Elizabeths that are connected to her. She feels all their pain, which makes her want for revenge even greater. Plus, she also had to drown her own father, so not only could she not enact her revenge, she had to lose Booker. Despite getting what she wanted, which was to eliminate Comstock, nothing felt complete. So when she discovered this Comstock, she decided to torture him until she was satisfied. Obviously, this sort of ruins the ending of the main game since this was supposed to eliminate all the Comstocks, but I think the reason this occurred was because since Comstock left the Columbia reality and entered the Rapture reality, he was out of bounds of the Purge. As I said though, really great episode, but now things are going to start to dip. Episode 2 starts with Elizabeth in Paris, or at least her version of Paris. We can tell because of how dramatic everything is. All the residents greet her and treat her like royalty at times. Everyone's also singing along together, and there's even a bird that sings as well when it lands on her finger. Everything is absolutely exaggerated, but it's all taken away when Sally arrives. Elizabeth wakes up, and not only is there a ghost version of Booker here, but Atlas shows up. Atlas decides to shoot Elizabeth, but is stopped once she tells him that she can get him back to Rapture with the help of Dr. Suchong. Atlas is also now using Sally as a bargaining chip to get Elizabeth to do his bidding. I'm starting to get flashbacks. One thing I sort of glossed over was Booker as a ghost. Well, it seems to be a figment of her imagination, something she made up. She clearly cares about Booker, that is her father after all, so she's probably still trying to deal with the guilt of killing him back in the main game. But we aren't done with the bizarre twists as we find Elizabeth's dead body. Furthermore, due to this, she isn't able to see the different realities and the tears in the doors like she used to. She's just a normal human girl without any way to leave Rapture when she's done. The Lutesses warned that if she went to Rapture to enact revenge on this Comstock, she would collapse, so to speak. I think collapse in this context is the other Elizabeth's merging with her, removing her powers and becoming a normal human again. I don't think it's explained why she loses her powers, but it's possible that entering the different reality changed her powers a bit, but that's just speculation. More importantly though, I have to ask, how did she die? This is confirmed to be the same Elizabeth from the main game, the same one who trapped Songbird in Rapture immediately after getting her powers back. But she was somehow stopped by a Big Daddy? It's possible that she isn't on the same power level anymore due to her being in a different reality, as we can see her struggling to open a very tiny tear early in the episode. So maybe what I say is true, or maybe I'm just making creative excuses for the devs to get away with this. Either way, Elizabeth's new objective is to rescue Sally. She feels guilt over using her as bait and hurting her to torture Comstock. She realizes that just as Comstock used her to get what he wants, she used Sally to get what she wanted, making her no better than the man she despised. She wants to make things right and make sure Sally has a future, and to do this she needs to work with Atlas, and this is where I started to lose interest. Infinite tried so hard to separate itself from the other game, and it succeeded. Whether or not you agree with this decision is up to you, but you can't deny that it's its own experience. So why are we going back and using story from the first game? It seems like the studio just couldn't get away from their pride and joy that is Bioshock 1 and needed to come up with a story to sell the DLC. Firstly, Elizabeth needs to find Suchong, and while she doesn't find him, she does find his temporary lab. In here is photos of Columbia as well as a tear. It's explained that the tear Elizabeth used to get to Rapture took her here, so Suchong, with the assistance of Andrew Ryan, moved his equipment here to study the tear. Eventually he would come in contact with Jeremiah Fink, and the two would collaborate and steal each other's ideas. This led to the creation of the Vigors and Songbird. It also led to the creation of the Big Daddies, but only partially, as Suchong was still trying to figure out how Songbird bonded with Elizabeth, as this was the critical piece he was missing when it came to the Big Daddies. With this discovery, Elizabeth realizes that she can use the tear to get into Columbia and grab the Lutece particle so that she can make the department store float just like Columbia floats. Sadly though, the device was destroyed, so she needs to repair it. Once it's fixed, we can take the tear to Columbia. You may be confused as to how a Columbia like this exists, and honestly, so am I. It seems like the main game really tied things up, so by adding a new Columbia, it sort of invalidates all that progress. Even if this is just a tear to the past, it's still a Columbia. This shouldn't really be here. Furthermore, we also see a behind-the-scenes conversation between the Lutesses and Daisy. We learn that the Lutesses were behind the actions of Daisy back in Finkton, explaining that Daisy will die and that she needs to play her part in order for Elizabeth to become a woman, and once again I'm left confused. Daisy has spent years under the oppression of Columbia and its residents. She's also been a leader of the Vox for presumably a few years as well, and she's willing to throw all this away because the Lutesses tell her what to do? Might I remind you that the Lutesses worked for Father Comstock, the person she's trying to kill, so how can she even trust them? Furthermore, if the Lutesses even manage to convince her by showing her other realities or by predicting the future, then this ruins part of the main game's story, as Booker could have easily just told her that he was from a different timeline and not an imposter, which could have stopped all the people we killed that were a part of the Vox. It's never explained what ultimately convinced her, so the team is once again able to get away with this vague scene. Changing the story by giving away very little information that A was never hinted at and B should have never even happened is not good storytelling. And also, in an effort to clown this scene again because I think it's funny, all they said was to take the boy hostage, nothing about the blood wiping, so once again I have to ask what the point was. Eventually Elizabeth will grab the Lutece particle, but Suchong won't let her leave until she gets him hair of the test subject that was bonded to Songbird, which is quite funny as he is literally talking to that test subject. The hair sample is located in Fink's office and is a really nice location as we get to see all the tests that he ran trying to get Songbird to connect with Elizabeth. It's also pretty horrifying the depths he was willing to go to do something like this, like hooking up an animal to a mask that would constantly pump oxytocin into their lungs, as well as the other failed test subjects still in the laboratory. Elizabeth then grabs the hair sample and delivers it to Suchong via pneumo tube, and I don't think it's ever explained in this game, but shouldn't the pneumo tubes be connected? I can't imagine that the tube packages the item and floats it across the water, so how does this get from point A to point B? When Fontaine died, Ryan forced Suchong to work for him, and that's why his new lab was at the Artemis Suites, far away from this department store. Plus, the store is thousands of meters below Rapture since Ryan sunk it. So is the pneumo tube still connected to the other tube, or was there never a tube in the first place? It's not a huge concern, just something I noticed. After delivering the hair, Ryan appears on the intercom and attempts to kill us. We escape his thugs, make it to the desired location, use the Lutece particle to float the department store back up to Rapture, and then get knocked out by Atlas's men. After this, the story goes back to the roots of Bioshock 1, as Atlas wants us to look for the ace in the hole, who of course is Jack. And while I was very excited to see Jack in some fashion, I don't even really think this was necessary. In the over 10 years since I played the first Bioshock game, not once did I wonder how Atlas got Jack. I think it's more important that he got Jack at all more than how he got him. There's also a myriad of ways you could have explained that he got him to Rapture. This is going to be a bit bold of me, but I'd like to rewrite this episode in a way that would make more sense, at least to me. Firstly, remove any mention of Atlas up until this point. Allow Elizabeth to get up and question how she is alive along with Booker. It'll draw more attention to how Elizabeth ended episode 1 standing and is now starting this episode on the ground. Maybe even add some blood as well to show that she didn't pass out but was actually injured. With Atlas in the picture, all I could care about was him. I didn't even bother questioning how Booker even got here. The way Booker's written into this episode is totally fine. I'm actually okay with him just being a figment of her imagination. The rest of the episode should be spent trying to find Sally, and then this would be a good time to have Sally also be held by Suchong, since it'll force Elizabeth to go to Columbia and get her hair in exchange for Sally. This, however, though, does involve the Lutece particle and Columbia, something I'd prefer to avoid in this episode, so maybe we can have some joke scene where Elizabeth reveals to Suchong that she is in fact the test subject, and then maybe have Suchong freak out and get a little angry at the fact that the solution to his issue was literally right in front of him. And seeing as he's in Rapture and not the department store, this could make Suchong be the sole reason the store was lifted, as he needs her hair. This not only connects the following scene with Andrew Ryan, where he says that the deal between Suchong and Elizabeth was not one he was authorized to make, but this also fits narratively with Suchong as a character who not only worked with Fontaine before he died and could maybe discover the real identity of Atlas, but also show that he is still a person willing to do anything to get what he wants. Once Elizabeth makes it to Suchong, she can then drop off her hair, and then right when she meets Sally, she gets knocked out by some thugs, which leads to the scene right here. Once this starts, have the bag stay on Elizabeth's head, but have Atlas talk to his crew while we're here. It sets up Atlas, but also lets the veteran players get excited as his accent is very recognizable. They could even change the name to Man instead of Atlas in the subtitles momentarily so that the reveal isn't spoiled. Then, when the hype of his appearance is still high, rip the bag off and show him. Even keeping this part where the light blocks his face but then reveals him as he steps closer would have also worked as well. Personally, I would have preferred this DLC just continue its own story and have Atlas be revealed in the last few moments. Since Atlas is now a main character in this episode from the start, it takes all focus off everyone else as he's easily the most important character in this episode. Doing this would also remove the questionable decisions that Elizabeth makes throughout this DLC, as from the moment she meets with him, she knows that she'll betray him, and it ruins all the build-up when it's not only hammered in multiple times that Atlas will likely betray her, but also the fact that Elizabeth keeps helping him despite knowing she won't get the upper hand on him. As we discover at the end, the reason she's doing this is because within all the doors there was a timeline that shows Sally having a future thanks to Jack rescuing her. But to do this, she needs to go along with the events of the story in order to make this all happen, which not only undermines all the power and skill Atlas has as a leader, but also makes the reveal of how Atlas got his hands on Jack just really awkward. Furthermore, the only reason she was able to do any of this was because of Booker, who reminds her that she used to see all the doors, meaning she has all the memories of all the doors, regardless of whether it was the past, present, or future. So Booker tries to get her to remember where the location of the ace in the hole is. This confirmed a suspicion I had, and that was that Booker was placed in this episode strictly to explain plots and discoveries the writers couldn't explain on their own, and this makes everything feel so forced. Just have Booker stay a memory, her memory of Booker, the Booker who she grew to love and appreciate, and have him be the shoulder she can cry on. They are father and daughter after all. Don't add this current Booker that is helping discover the next step in the story because Elizabeth can't remember or is incapable of making a decision. It just feels like such a waste to have the story the way it is now, and it goes back to what I said earlier as it answers a question we didn't even really need answered. The best thing to come from this part though was the interrogation scene, which makes me extremely uncomfortable.
Where's me ace in the hole?
I don't know.
You know what else rests in the lobe? Creativity. Individuality. Personality. In short, what makes you, you.
Continuing with the story though, Elizabeth needs to get to Suchong's clinic in order to find info on Jack. She then finds the paper that has the "would you kindly" passphrase and then gives it to Atlas. During this level, we do get to see how Suchong died rather than hearing it, and while cool, the story is doing that thing again where it's trying to fit Elizabeth into the plot by having her be the sole reason behind all these events. She was the reason that the Big Daddies could bond to any little sister. She was then responsible for Suchong's death and is of course responsible for the events of the whole series since she gave Atlas the passphrase for Jack. It's completely unnecessary to do all of this, and I have no idea why they thought this was a good idea. Also, unless I'm mistaken, I'm pretty sure the bonding process was created using pheromones of the Big Daddies combined with the mental conditioning that the Little Sisters underwent. We use the pheromones ourselves in Bioshock 1, and we get to see the Little Sisters' minds in Bioshock 2, so this whole scene is confusing as it implies that just a little bit of Adam was all that was needed. Even though it's known that the Big Daddies were spliced beyond belief to even get them to function in the suits, so they already have Adam in them, plus the Adam the Little Sisters have is probably recycled. You could claim that the Little Sisters have unique Adam since their bodies do contain the sea slug that produces it, but we can see them drinking Adam on occasion in game, thus it's recycled anyway. So this is just confusing for no reason. Elizabeth has such a vital role in her own reality, but they needed to make her have the same role in the Rapture reality, but it was just unnecessary. Now instead of saying that the addiction of Adam, the feud between Fontaine and Ryan, and the values of Rapture were all contributing factors to not only the downfall of Rapture but the events of the game, it can now just be boiled down to Elizabeth did it to help Sally. It ruins years of work, and that is extremely upsetting. After Elizabeth gets the passphrase, she gives it to Atlas as she has to since it will lead to Sally being rescued, to which she receives a wrench to the head for her assistance. We then get a slideshow of the events that took place in Bioshock 1 and see that her vision became a reality as Sally is rescued by Jack and given a future. As she comes back to reality, we can see her holding Sally while Elizabeth eventually succumbs to her wounds and dies, thus ending the DLC. Burial at Sea wasn't terrible, but it definitely wasn't great either. It's a DLC that probably didn't need to exist, but I would have accepted its existence if it didn't fumble so hard in the second episode. The DLC not only has a few retcons and plot holes, but also undermines all the story and world building the original game set out to create by pinning all the events on one character. A character that shouldn't have even had this vital of a role in the first place, and arguably shouldn't have even been here anyway. Infinite was made to be different and a separation from the series, and while I didn't appreciate it that much, as I've said before, I will at least commend them for sticking to their original vision and trying to create something new. Despite that, they still couldn't get away from Rapture and thus needed to go back. Was it great to see Rapture in its prime as well as the original cast of characters? Absolutely, but the rest of the DLC soured any enjoyment that I had from it. Bioshock Infinite as a whole is a surreal experience. It's got a compelling story with a wonderful twist and a great dynamic between the two main characters, and even a decent setup to a DLC in episode 1, culminating in a good game. But it also has a lack of interesting audio logs, bland gameplay, repetitive locations, and an abysmal second episode that ruins the great parts Infinite established, tearing it down in the process. Had Infinite just ended at the main game, I would have called it great, or even fantastic, but Burial at Sea went too far. It's sad that the series had ended on such a conflicting note like this, where people are more than likely to argue whether or not the game was even good to begin with, rather than just appreciating how far the series has come. Infinite leaves a permanent stain on this series' fantastic legacy, and that's truly what upsets me the most. Despite Bioshock Infinite being the final game in the series, we still have more Bioshock to talk about, as throughout the game's lifecycle, 2 books were written, Bioshock Rapture and Bioshock Mind in Revolt. Now both of these books are not comics, so this won't be the most visually entertaining section, but I will try to provide footage of the characters and locations mentioned. So if a book happens to mention Finkton, for example, then I'll put some Finkton gameplay on screen, as well as any characters that are mentioned as well. Also, because of some possible copyright concerns, I won't be talking about every detail and thus will only be summarizing the important parts. Hopefully though, it will be enough to get you a general understanding of the material so that you can come to a decision on whether or not you should read it yourself. So firstly, let's get the easy one out of the way. Bioshock Mind in Revolt is a 30-page ebook written by Joe Fielder. Mind in Revolt was actually written in-house, as Joe Fielder was one of the writers for the game. So this story is separated into different parts, as the different chapters are various interviews with Daisy Fitzroy, which are being conducted by a Dr. Francis Pinchot. These chapters aren't published in a professional manner, as they're just notes and transcripts, and we can see from the foreword and afterword of the book that the person putting all these together is a Dr. Pettifog. The reason he has decided to publish these interviews is that he believes this will lead to a better Columbia. However, Dr. Pettifog is rightfully worried about the outcome of this publication, as Dr. Francis was meeting with the city's most notorious criminal, and from what we'll see in the notes, he is indifferent about her as he cares more about her mind rather than her actions. So some people may see him as a traitor and refuse to see the results of his work. All of these interviews occurred over 6 days, as our first transcript is May 7th, 1909, and our last is May 13th, 1909. That means the events of Bioshock Infinite have yet to occur, as that was in 1912. The first question though is, how did Dr. Francis meet with Daisy? Well, according to the first transcript, Daisy Fitzroy was captured by some authorities down in Finkton. After hearing this news, he immediately gathered all the paperwork necessary that would allow him to interview her. Dr. Francis believes that while the people of Columbia are objectively better than the people down below, referring to those in the United States, he thinks much can be learned from these lesser people. He wants to see what makes these people tick, and hopes that discovering this information could lead to treatment. His logic is definitely there, but it's a bit flawed, as it seems like he wants to see why people who don't conform to Columbia's ideals are the way that they are in hopes of treating them to see the beauty that Columbia provides. It's not perfect, but in terms of therapy, he's kind of on the right track. Before the interview begins, Dr. Francis reads off a list of her crimes, which were included but not limited to murder, transportation of firearms, manufacturing of explosive devices, and the printing of material that promoted unionization, public assembly, and the general undermining of the Colombian government. That last crime refers to her manifesto called The People's Voice, which is a book we can find in-game, although we aren't actually allowed to read it. Even though we already know this, Mind in Revolt does confirm that all of this started after the death of Lady Comstock, as we know that Father Comstock killed her and then blamed it on Daisy. As you would expect, she is very uncooperative in this interview, so Dr. Francis takes the opportunity to read some of the quotes in the manifesto. Eventually, Daisy will speak out and the two will get into an argument, as Daisy sees Dr. Francis like everyone else in Columbia. As she says, when it comes down to it, one snake is the same as any other. Dr. Francis attempts to reassure her that he merely just wants to understand her and not harm her. So the following day, he lets Daisy ask the first question. The two would then discuss how each arrived in Columbia, and we learn that Daisy, along with many other Black, Mexican, Irish, Chinese, and Jewish people, were just brought in during the dead of night. Many were either convinced to come aboard due to Columbia waiving their past crimes, some needed money to feed their families, and others were just taken from their homes. Dr. Francis is quite shocked at the revelation to hear that Fink would knowingly employ criminals and finds it absurd. This interview would be the first of many times Dr. Francis would hear about the truth of Columbia, and we'll eventually get to see how this affects him later on. After days of interviews, Dr. Francis' supervisor is becoming quite unhappy regarding his results and suggests that a change in strategy be implemented. He suggests that they conduct a phrenology test, which was ultimately discredited years later and has been the cause of many racist and sexist claims, such as certain races being inferior to others due to the shape of their brain, and that women's brains have larger sections for childcare and religion, while they had smaller sections for arts and sciences. His supervisor also recommends a new study that they're conducting, which would eventually be called lobotomy. Neither of these are something Dr. Francis wants, as he claims that his style is vital to Columbia's growth. More interviews will continue, and we can see Dr. Francis getting more and more annoyed at her, calling her responses blasphemous. Eventually, Daisy will make a remark towards the doctor, which causes him to slap her. She laughs a bit after this encounter, as she's finally able to see the real doctor, as she claims. Wednesday, May 12th, a few days before Daisy will be put under the supervisor's orders and forced to be lobotomized, was where the shortest interview took place, as Dr. Francis is reading back the results of her IQ test and discovered that Daisy scored a 149, which not only according to the scoring means she is a genius in the eyes of Columbia, but is also higher than Dr. Francis himself, who scored a 146. After seeing these results, though, he will end the interview to think about how to proceed next. Clearly, he's running out of time, and his supervisor is getting very annoyed at his lack of progress. In his private journal, we can read a transcript between the two of them that occurred once he shut the voxophone off. Overall, I don't mind how this was handled, but it did seem a bit fast, as one day there is no progress, then the next day she spills her entire plan. This is also the reason why writing in this format can be very restrictive, as it's meant to mimic a compilation of journal and recording entries, so we obviously won't hear any of this since this was discussed after the recording was turned off. It makes sense in regards to the format of the story, it just feels a bit out of nowhere and caused a bit of whiplash while reading. As for her plans though, she spoke about a plot to break her out of jail, and that if Dr. Francis is involved in her escape, it will end in little to no bloodshed. This actually changes Dr. Francis's thoughts regarding his work, as while he is an upstanding citizen of Columbia, doubts have started to creep into his mind. This made him realize that sin exists in all men, regardless of their place in life, as while he thinks very highly of himself and is void of such rebellious ideas, to discover that these thoughts were in his mind was a bit shattering to him. He attempted to quell these thoughts within him, but realized intense transformation would be required to do so, such as changing the current Comstock Center from a research facility to a re-education center. But the thought of torturing these patients with auditory and visual stimuli that would ultimately force them to conform to the proper ideals of Columbia is terrifying and something he once again wants to avoid. The final day approaches, and during their final interview, we can see that Daisy has the upper hand as she's the one controlling the interview, while Dr. Francis is still consumed by the thoughts of what he believes is right for Columbia, but also what is right for himself. Eventually, a break-in occurs, and Dr. Francis decides that he will end up helping Daisy and gives her a set of keys that will not only unlock some of the facility's doors, but also her cell. She meets up with some of her men and thanks the doctor for helping her escape, but before leaving gives him a parting gift, which is a bullet through his head. Her final line before killing Dr. Francis is, "It ain't a matter of have to, it's a matter of want." It seems that despite how honest Dr. Francis was with his intentions regarding their interview, Daisy refused to believe him and only saw him as a pawn in her game. Honestly, this was quite a sad story, as Dr. Francis, albeit still stuck in his ways, was at least willing to learn from Daisy, which is something not many people in Columbia would even try to do. To end the publication, we have an afterword from Dr. Pettifog, who explains that despite Dr. Francis' interest in Daisy, the blame is not entirely his own, as the betrayal of the mind can happen to anyone, even the great citizens of Columbia. And it was thanks to his bravery and research that they were able to come up with an array of treatment methods which will be hosted at the all-new Comstock Re-Education Center. Dr. Francis's worst thoughts had come to life. The facility turned towards more forceful methods of change, and we can see this in-game as the Comstock house level is the re-education center. We can see the numerous slideshows of phrenology and lobotomy, as well as the results they had on the patients. It's a truly horrific sight. Mind in Revolt was a short but sweet story. It's not a necessary read, as it only discussed one instance within the Columbian timeline that ultimately wasn't too important, but for $3 on Amazon, it was definitely worth the price. So if you're interested in a bit of the thoughts on Daisy Fitzroy, then I recommend you pick this up. Our final book is Bioshock Rapture, an over 400-page novel that details some of the events prior to the first Bioshock game. As opposed to the previous book that was written in-house, this was written by a third-party author named John Shirley. However, the project was overseen by game director Ken Levine, and according to some tweets and interviews regarding the book, he also got to write the epilogue and prologue, while John Shirley handled the rest. To some of you, that name may sound familiar, as while he does produce some books of his own, he was also contracted to write many books for other games such as Halo, Watch Dogs, and Borderlands. So before things begin, we can read a prologue that takes place before Rapture's creation, and it gives us a look into why it was created. The two characters in the prologue are Andrew Ryan and Sullivan. Sullivan was a security officer for Ryan, which is how the two met. He came into Ryan's office to give him the reports he asked for and was displeased with both of them. One was about the ongoing union strikes and how many companies' workers were fighting for better rights. Ryan believes these workers to be Soviet agents, as Russia was going under similar strikes at the same time. He finds it absurd that they want better wages and working conditions, as he claims that this is the basis of socialism, something Ryan is definitely not fond of. The final report was the nail in the coffin for Ryan. He received reports of what occurred in Japan during World War II. The report not only had pictures of the bombings, but the effects they had on some of the citizens that survived. He realized that the world was spiraling into chaos, and with nuclear weapons being created, an all-out atomic war would be inevitable. So Ryan set his plans in motion. He plans to make a place untouched by the government where people live away from rules and regulations. We of course know this to be Rapture. Before the prologue ends, we get a backstory of Ryan's escape from Russia. We also get to learn his full name, which I don't recall ever being stated in the games before, but it is Andrei Ranovsky. His backstory goes into grave detail about the world that Andrew Ryan saw with his eyes, saying things like the dawn sky, the colors of a deep bruise, and the cutting wind serrated by sleet. The problem with books is the lack of a visual, which is why they tend to go into detail about the surroundings to give the reader an idea of what to imagine, and I'm glad this style wasn't lost when making this book. However, there is a minor inconsistency, as the book states he fled Russia in 1918, when in fact in game it was 1919. Not a huge deal, but something I just wanted to mention. Part 1 of the book covers chapters 1 through 5, and it's all about the building of Rapture. We also get to meet our protagonist Bill McDonough. Bill was contracted to help fix something at the building that Ryan owned, which is how the two met. We also learn that the reason Andrew Ryan is so rich is that he owns a significant amount of oil and coal on top of owning the second biggest railroad in the country. Details like this occur throughout the whole book, and it's definitely something I took a liking to. At the end of the day, it's not important how Ryan got his money, just that he had the money to build Rapture, but the book wanted to add these details to piece together the small holes left by the game. It's the details that'll make you say, oh, so that's how that happened, or that's why this occurred, and the book manages to excel at this. Something else I noticed was the use of audio logs from the games, as on page 30, Bill is currently fixing Ryan's toilet, and when Ryan sees his work, he asks about the type of fitting, claiming that the other guys are using tin while Bill is using brass. This is taken directly from an audio log in-game.
Wait, says he. What's with all the brass fittings? General contractor had me down for the tin. Well, I says, I suppose it's the contractor then who'll be bailing out your loo once a fortnight, is it? If it's price you're worried about, I'll be picking up the brass, so not to worry, Squire.
This small inclusion made me feel a lot more comfortable when reading, as the story and its additional material were taken into consideration. It sounds like the bare minimum when it comes to writing a book for a game, but I appreciated it nonetheless. The rest of the part switches between Bill McDonough and a Frank Gorland. Frank Gorland is a simple bartender that likes to fudge games of boxing to make a quick buck, and also likes to use the bar as a way to gain information. Some of this information he received was on the project that Andrew Ryan was working on, and he figured that if he could get involved in this project, he could take it from under his nose. If that sounds like someone specific, then you would be right, as by the end of the part, we discover that Frank Gorland is actually Frank Fontaine. His chapters were excellent, as they showed the lengths he's willing to go to get what he wants, and also displayed his skill at creating different identities and personalities, as he switches quite a lot throughout the part. By the end of part 1, he is close to finding out Ryan's plan, but he hasn't found out where the project is. As for Bill McDonough, he's made quite the impression on Andrew Ryan and has been promoted to the lead contractor for the building of Rapture. Ryan took Bill on a trip to visit some of his friends, these friends of course being Jasmine Jolene and Sander Cohen. Sander Cohen was used in this part as a way for Ryan to show Bill how some of these people are constrained by the world and hopes to create a society that doesn't need to worry about these constraints. Eventually, Ryan and Bill will leave and take a trip to Iceland, to which a boat will be waiting to take them to the building site of Rapture. Ryan also shows Bill a small model of the city and what he plans to have it look like. He also explains how Arcadia works, which is something I did not expect to read, as according to Ryan, Arcadia has a system that brings in reflected sunlight as well as electrical light. Then this will be used by the trees, which will eventually lead to them producing oxygen. Once again, a detail that ties in some of the questions left untouched by the game. The final pages of the part are Bill, Ryan, and many of the other contractors staring in awe at the foundation of Rapture, knowing that in time a new wonder of the world will be created. Part 2 is chapters 6 through 15, and this chapter tends to skip around a bit as we get to see many different characters take center stage for a bit, all while jumping around in the timeline as we go from 1949 to 1953 within just a couple dozen pages. These chapters are here to add more substance to the story by giving context to future events, providing more backstory on the game via audio logs, or just small conversations that flesh out the world. For example, there's a more detailed look at Julie Langford's audio log where she's upset that Ryan's turning her Arcadia Garden into a paid attraction, but then a few pages later there's a quick scene between Sophia Lamb and a patient of hers that gets interrupted momentarily when Eleanor comes into the room. Since this part spans many years in the Rapture timeline, lots of progress has been made and many people are flocking to the underwater city in hopes of striking it big. We also get to see lots of the game's cast in this part, as many of the main and side characters from both games are given center stage. Think of it as an anthology of sorts, as every few pages the story pivots to another scene, and since they're so far apart from one another, most of the short stories don't contradict or overlap. I really liked being able to see all the characters in these new situations, as they all have these unique reactions to everything going on, not just in Rapture but in the moment. Like this one part where Tenenbaum and Su Chong are trying to perform a pregnancy examination. and it's hilarious hearing them talk about this child like it's a test subject and conversating about their experiences in examining children, all while completely ignoring the fact that this woman they're testing on is crying out in extreme pain. But while most of this part is broken up into small stories, there is some important developments happening within them, as we start to see the beginning of Sophia Lamb and her family via the free therapy sessions, as well as the discovery and creation of Adam. We also get to read about some of the more depressing events that transpire in Rapture, like all the people who feel trapped and alone as they can't leave Rapture due to Ryan's orders, or how someone screwed over another man's business, which eventually led to a dispute and a shootout. I like that this book was able to convey to the reader that Rapture wasn't a complete utopia. We already knew this from the games, but we only understood that things became problematic after Rapture was up and running, but things are going wrong and it's not even finished yet. Towards the end of the part is where we get to the real meat of the story, as splicers are introduced, Fontaine and Ryan are attempting to take each other down, and people are irritated about the living conditions. Things haven't fully gone to shit yet, as the bombing in 1958 is still a couple years away, but it's very clear that Rapture is starting to crack. The book is slowly but surely giving us all the different events of Rapture that would eventually lead to its downfall. Part 2 is by far the longest part, taking up around half the book, and it is by far my favorite part, as there is tons of references to past locations and characters that allow us to take what we already know about them and apply it to these pages. I found myself remembering all their backstories when old characters appeared and tried to take that into consideration when they were relevant to the scene. While this part was initially all over the place and sometimes a bit hard to organize when taking into account the full timeline, it ultimately doesn't matter, as once again most of these stories aren't relevant to one another and are spread far apart enough that they won't contradict or overlap. But as the part reached the end, it started injecting familiar material that fans of the games would remember, along with a cohesive story that would set up the final part. Part 3 is chapters 15 through 20 and is very similar to the end of part 2 in the sense that there are sporadic stories that may jump ahead a few months or a year, but they all connect on this very thin timeline that make up the actual story. This part not only has a few pages dedicated to providing background on events we already know of, but also allow us to see many events that were briefly talked about in the games. For example, the raid on Fontaine Futuristics that would eventually lead to the fake death of Fontaine and the creation of Atlas, as well as the bombing on New Year's Eve, were all mentioned, and we're not only able to see the events happen, but also the aftermath of said events. We were also able to get an in-depth look on the conversation between Fontaine, Suchong, and Tenenbaum regarding the mental conditioning of Jack and how they were going to steal Ryan's child, and even the doubts that Tenenbaum would have throughout the story that would eventually lead to how we see her in-game, as she has a change of heart about the little sisters. These were fantastic to read about, and I was so excited to see how all of this fit into the story. However, not all of these events had the same feeling. There's a few inconsistencies in this part as well. We talked about one before regarding the year Ryan left Russia, but there's also a few more in these later chapters. The book never mentions any discoveries of tears within Rapture, which we know did exist at some point thanks to Burial at Sea. However, this book was written in 2011, a few years before Burial at Sea was even released, so I'm willing to overlook this simply because the game was still in development. However, one I won't forgive is Jasmine's death. As we know, in Fort Frolic, Sander Cohen wants us to kill some of his associates so we can display their picture on his art project. To kill one of them, we need to go into the room where Jasmine was killed so that we can get him to spawn in the bar behind us. In this room is Jasmine's body along with a bloody weapon, implying she was beat to death. We also hear some of the conversation thanks to some of the ghostly apparitions that occur throughout the game. So it's clear that she was killed with a weapon, but according to the book, Ryan strangled her to death. Now you could make the argument that he strangled her then hit her with a blunt object, but the book never mentions anything about a weapon, so it leads me to believe that they had incorrectly added this. What bothers me the most is that this is a required and integral part of the story and was somehow missed despite this being overlooked by game director Ken Levine, as well as all the other writers and designers that Shirley was in contact with. I can see some small detail being left out that was maybe mentioned once in a random audio log, but for something such as this that is not only one of the most important parts of Bioshock's story, but is also required to watch if you want to complete the game, is baffling how this was incorrect. As we go through the final pages, everything is turning into the Rapture we know from the games. Raids for food are happening all the time, Ryan is losing influence, and the little sisters are patrolling the hallways for Adam. At the end, Diane McClintock, who you'll remember from Bioshock 1 as Ryan's love interest for a time, and also the one who recorded that bombing during New Year's Eve, ends up joining Atlas and betraying Ryan until she accidentally discovers that Atlas is Fontaine, and even though she would have definitely kept his secret, Atlas couldn't take the chance and stabs her, letting her bleed out on the floor. This is just like the other events we talked about before, as this was literally from an audio log in-game, but now we get to see the full story behind it. As for our protagonist, if we remember from an audio log in the game, we know that he was going to kill Ryan if he had to, and when Bill, his wife Eileen, and his daughter Sophie attempt to escape Rapture, he realizes what needs to be done. He points his gun at Ryan, but he couldn't do it. Ryan gave him this job and allowed him to create his city, and it's because of his generosity that he couldn't pull the trigger. Ryan takes the opportunity to fight back, smacking Bill in the head with his cane, and while Bill maintains the upper hand by bashing him with his gun, he once again couldn't finish the job. He wishes Andrew Ryan good luck and leaves his office. The family, along with Bill's friend Roland Wallace, make it to the bathyspheres and take it all the way back up to the lighthouse, but they're caught by Ryan's guards. These guards are Karlowski, Redgrave, and Candivish, names you won't be familiar with but were quite frequent throughout the book, and are friends of Bill. Everyone is arguing over what to do as Bill and his family want to leave, but the guards won't let him. Everyone is also split in regards to Bill's family, as while the order was just for Roland and Bill, there was nothing about his wife and child. Eventually, an argument would break out between the three guards that left one dead. Redgrave and Karlowski take Bill and Wallace back to Rapture, but allow his wife and child to leave. As for their fates, Roland Wallace became a test subject for Sue Chong and was subjected to the enraged plasmid, which we can hear the results of from an audio log in Bioshock 1, and Bill is executed for his crimes. We can see Bill's body in-game and it shows that he was crucified, but according to the book, since Redgrave and Karlowski liked Bill, they opted to kill him first as to not let him suffer. Even though Bill's capture was Ryan's order, Andrew Ryan didn't come to the execution, showing that even though he was a traitor, he was ultimately losing a dear friend and couldn't see him die. I love the relationship these two had throughout the book, as through Bill's eyes we're able to see this different Andrew Ryan, one that had a bit more compassion and more drive. The final pages are about Bill's family, who are now on the surface. His daughter was diagnosed with agoraphobia thanks to Rapture, and while a bit better off, Eileen is still suffering from everything that occurred. The last line is the two talking about how Bill would have loved to see the surface again. Bioshock Rapture was fantastic. I've always been a visual learner, which is why I prefer manga over books like this, but I can't deny that for only $10, this was a genuinely great read. And that goes for Mind and Revolt as well. I highly recommend both books if you have the time and money for them. If you're interested in a bit of the backstory regarding Daisy Fitzroy, then Mind and Revolt will be a short but sweet read. As for Bioshock Rapture, I think if you enjoy Rapture even just a little bit, you will love this book. The constant callbacks to past events and characters, as well as its ability to fill in some of the gaps left by the story, was more than enough to give it my recommendation. With all the games and books discussed, I can finally say that we have reached the end of Bioshock. Despite the criticism that I gave, I would ultimately recommend everything discussed in this video. That goes for both the books and games. While some are better than others, each one has at least something that makes the game worth playing, whether that's the setting, characters, or world building. Each game excels at something. It is without a doubt one of the best series ever made, and I can't thank you enough for allowing me to talk about them one more time. But even though I said this was the end, apparently it's not, as Netflix has announced a Bioshock movie, and I guess a fourth game is in production. There is very little information surrounding these additions to the series, but I will attempt to remain hopeful. Video game movies and shows are either amazing or terrible, and while I'm always willing to give it a try, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't worried. I think a good setting for the movie would definitely be pre-Civil War Rapture, but that would inevitably run into issues with the book, so continuity and canon discussion will probably occur. As for the game, apparently on a podcast called The Sacred Symbols, the host claims that the game will take place in a 1960s city in Antarctica called Borealis. Admittedly, that does sound quite interesting, but what's more worrying is the story surrounding the game. This is around the same time as Bioshock 1, and while it is far away from Rapture, are they just going to move away from it altogether, or will the team make reference to it? I feel like it could be possible if this could work, as long as they don't mention anyone from the current trilogy. It would suck, but if they start adding characters we're familiar with, then we'll have to take the other games into account, which will probably result in a really messy story. Regardless, if any of these projects are actually released, expect me to talk about them when they do. For the final time though, thank you all for joining me on this journey through the Bioshock series, and I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new. We have a ton more games I'd love to cover, so if this style of videos is interesting to you, then I hope you stick around for more. As always, thank you to my returning viewers for coming back to another video, and with that, take care everyone, and goodbye.